It's great to be here. It's great to see so many familiar and friendly faces, meet so many of you for the first time. And thank you for the introduction and kind words, Mason. I'm here for two words today: partnership and action. That's really what I've been hearing over the last few days through the various events and speakers. And I just want to start by saying we need you here in this room, every one of you, to execute on this opportunity. We can't do this alone. We have to work together. And we'll soon hear from our partners in the DFIs, our partners from the world of policy, from debt capital markets, our critically important female partners. And I know that the next session is around the other P, philanthropy. And I'm so proud to be here today to share with you all in the success that we've been able to generate together in forming CSEF. No matter how wealthy the individuals that I work for and other leading climate philanthropies, we have to recognize that the amount of money that we are able to produce for this kind of work is a drop in the bucket. When we think about the quantum of capital that we need to move, the money that we have has to be considered a catalyst. In the true chemical sense of the word, we sprinkle a tiny little bit of this pixie dust, and magically it creates a much larger reaction in the market. And so we're always looking for these bigger multiples of our work. And as an example, CSEF 1 started back in 2017, literally with me standing in front of a PowerPoint, furiously waving my hands saying, "Trust me, this is going to work. It's going to be a big thing." And you know, I twisted a few arms, got $100,000 here from a friend, $100,000 there from someone who owed me a favor, brought in $500,000, then millions followed, and we're here today. But I want to be sure to say that the course that led us to meeting Mason and Josh and the whole fantastic team at Clime was never a straight path. It always had a roller coaster. It was never a guarantee that I'd be standing here today with a real likelihood that we're going to be hitting the max cap of $175 million in CSEF 2. I mean, this is a fantastic step forward in our journey, and there's so many partners here today who are making this happen. With a clear vision of how we can spark the market, that is how we can make these things happen. So we have to have a constant North Star, a constant direction setting of where we're going toward. And that's how we can bring together all these fantastic partners and run through that gauntlet. And blended finance means a lot of things to a lot of different people. In fact, there's no specific definition of it. But you just kind of know in your gut when you see something that's working. And I think it's imperative on us to really think through some of the really nerdy details of how this blended finance vehicles are structured, so that we constantly are looking for that ultra high leverage, that ultra catalytic impact, where we can say that our dollar is multiplied and multiplied and multiplied and really can serve to unlock these markets. That's the key. We need to make sure that we're focused on moving quickly towards action. That's our purpose. And it's so exciting to be here talking about this in an event where, well, so those of you who know me well, I don't go to a lot of events. I have a pretty self-imposed strict travel policy, and being here today, I'm reminded that I am not much of a talker. I prefer to do. I want to do deals. That's why when we met Mason, we met Josh, we met the team, we have this concept. We have so many fantastic partners with us. It's about action. It's about execution. It's about being out there in the field with tangible results, tangible projects, actually achieving climate impact. That's really the purpose. And I'm so proud to be here today, back in the home of my alma mater, INSEAD. So back in 20 years ago, I've been away. So happy to come back home. I'm pleased to celebrate the ongoing partnership with Allied Climate Partners that I'm here representing, our hosts Clime, Philanthropy Asia Alliance, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which I think can safely be said is the most forward-thinking regulator, central bank partner in the world. And I'm very pleased now to hand over to Ms. Gillian Tan, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of MAS, to share her thoughts on how our fantastic host country is going to make Singapore the blended finance capital of Asia. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So good to see so many folks in the room. I wanted to say, first and foremost, a big thank you to Temasek Trust, the Philanthropy Asia Alliance, and of course, Clime Capital, for bringing us together today and for inviting me to share a few thoughts on blended finance and philanthropy, which are really two key issues at the center of the climate agenda. It's not easy coming on after Bill, but I was glad he said that this is a gathering of nerds, because I do have a slightly nerdy speech. I was a bit worried about it yesterday evening, but it's good to know I'm among friends. Unlike Bill, I'm quite a talker, so brace yourselves. All right, so slightly less than 5 years ago, on the 11th of November 2019, to be precise, the Monetary Authority of Singapore launched what we called then the Green Finance Action Plan. And this was really the first time that we laid out our goal to make finance greener. How much progress have we made since then? Well, if we zero in on blended finance specifically, which I think is appropriate given the focus of today's event, we can really grade this across a number of criteria: awareness, effort, and volumes. So looking first at levels of awareness, I would say we have done fairly well. There are ongoing efforts to build awareness and encourage the utilization of blended finance in Asia. For example, back in 2021, the MAS held the very first Transition Finance Towards Net Zero conference here in Singapore to promote the scaling of blended finance in the region. And we have hosted these conferences annually since, including the FAST conference this morning. I think some of you might have been there. Another example that I wanted to talk about is the work of the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, and they've done work to establish guiding principles and policy recommendations to support blended finance in emerging economies. So awareness, not bad. Now, looking at criteria relating to effort, I would also say that regional efforts have been quite extensive. It's been a good start. It has been very encouraging to see the emergence of blended finance facilities dedicated to the region and to investments here. This includes, of course, CSAF, which is managed by Clime Capital. And as you probably all know, CSAF provides early-stage development capital to high-impact clean energy projects and other businesses that are driving the low-carbon transition in Southeast Asia. And it was really good to hear Bill talk about the traction and success that CSAF has seen. We have also seen the broader industry step forward. The recently established Singapore Sustainable Finance Association has made blended finance a key priority work stream, with a goal to foster collaboration and convene market players to build and scale blended finance models. So, good scores in awareness and effort. But if we were to look at quantitative measures of success, such as blended finance volumes, I'm afraid it would be difficult to score us highly. Around the time we launched the Green Finance Action Plan, and you remember it was about 5 years ago, climate-focused blended finance volumes within the Asia-Pacific stood at about $3 billion annually, US dollars. Fast forward to today, and annual blended finance volumes in APAC are actually lower at about $2 billion. ASEAN volumes have remained flat, with very little change between the level that we were seeing 5 years ago and what we see today. A further concern is that if we look at the volumes more closely, we see that financing gaps are especially large in certain sectors and certain areas. The majority of blended finance transactions have been focused on renewables, but for Asia to make a successful transition, financing is also badly needed in other areas, including the retirement of coal assets, climate tech, and the decarbonization of hard-to-abate industrial sectors. Now, it's important to say and to recognize that this is not just an Asia problem, but a global one. Blended finance, we all know, can be a powerful lever, but it remains quite underutilized even globally. Between 2015 and 2020, average annual flows of blended finance globally stood at less than $10 billion. This is a fraction of the 4.2 trillion required annually in developing countries to meet the SDGs. So as such, while there has been progress, there is still much more work that we need to do. We need to do better, and we need to do more and at a faster pace here in Asia, which accounts, as you know, for about half of global greenhouse gas emissions, and where about 80% of the world's coal generation takes place. At the same time, climate change is a profound existential threat in Asia, where 70% of the global population susceptible to sea level rise have their homes. Southeast Asia in particular will be one of the regions that will be hardest hit. Over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen temperatures of 44 degrees Celsius in Myanmar. This was the first time in Southeast Asia's history that such high temperatures have been reached at this time of the year. And the impact of this historic heat has been seen not only in Myanmar, but really across the region. We're all familiar with what we're seeing: school closures in the Philippines, heat stroke deaths in Malaysia. There is also an economic imperative. Analysis from the ADB has projected that the impact of climate change in Southeast Asia may reduce regional GDP by something like 11% by the end of this century, as we increasingly see the effects of climate change across key sectors such as agriculture, fishing, alongside impact to human health and productivity. We therefore find ourselves, I think, in a double whammy. The need to channel capital to sustainable infrastructure investments in the region is significant and urgent, yet capital is not flowing to where it needs to be. With such clear need and urgency, and we all know this and we're familiar with these narratives, why haven't we seen the results show up in the numbers? Well, bankability continues to be a significant challenge in Asia. Based on Marsh and McLennan's estimates, at least 35% of sustainable infrastructure projects are marginally bankable, with a further 55% being unbankable. Assuming these projects remain unfinanced, this represents a $2 trillion annual shortfall in the climate finance that Asia requires to reach net zero by 2050. Okay, problems. Thank you, Gillian. What is a possible path forward? How do we ensure that capital stays the course? Well, I think, as Bill alluded to, we first need to be very clear on what blended finance is. Our conversations about blended finance are often conversations about capital, specifically bringing together different types of capital. And, on this view, if we can just convene a pool of financiers, from commercial investors to philanthropic providers, we can crowd in the finance that we need. But actually, at its heart, blended finance is fundamentally about structuring and right-sizing risks. This allows senior or commercial capital providers, like some of you, to make appropriate risk-adjusted investments at scale and earn returns. So the conversations that we need to have are around risk. Now, if we adopt this lens, there are 3 key gaps that we need to address to achieve scale in blended finance: risk-tolerant capital, risk-centric approaches to partnerships, and risk mitigation. Let me cover each of these in turn. First, we need more risk-tolerant capital. Now, there are different layers of capital which are needed to finance climate-related initiatives. As I mentioned earlier, senior or commercial capital providers are willing to come in to support climate projects, but their mandates require them to make appropriate risk-adjusted investments and earn commercial returns. So this is where the PAA, PAS element comes in. Philanthropic and concessional providers can play a catalytic role in unlocking more investments for climate change by providing risk-tolerant capital to advance low-carbon projects that might be marginally bankable. This plays a powerful de-risking role, as we know, and can enable multiples of commercial investment and financing to be crowded in. We know all this. We probably also know that philanthropic appetite for this has been low. Of the, call it $800 billion of philanthropic giving in 2021, less than 2% was focused on climate change mitigation. Now, this has sometimes been attributed to a lack of awareness of the urgency of climate mitigation, or a lack of awareness of some of the more technical issues, for example, the economics surrounding renewables. What is also key, but less talked about, is how we build better bridges between the shape and form of philanthropic giving and the blended finance structures that we have been constructing. There is, for example, a quantum mismatch that is inherent in philanthropic involvement in capital-intensive investments, such as infrastructure. So grants and concessional capital from philanthropies and private wealth owners, they tend to come in smaller check sizes of a few millions, and they will require some aggregation to serve as the larger quantum of donor capital needed in each platform or structure that we're building. So something to think about. Now, the second gap that we need to plug is to adopt risk-centric approaches to partnerships. Let me put it simply. We will just not achieve scale in blended finance by looking only at philanthropic capital and expecting it to do magic. Was it pixie dust, Bill? Yes? Instead, we need to have the structures in place to bring together different types of partners who can take on different risks and plug different gaps. A risk-centric approach puts the risk question at its core by designing its structures and partnerships with risk mitigation considerations catered for upfront, and by building platforms where common interests, capital needs, and investment preferences can be brought together. Now, this pivot that I'm suggesting from a philanthropic-centric lens to a risk lens is important, because risk-tolerant capital is finite, and therefore the best blended finance structures maximize additionality while minimizing concessionality. This means that you deploy as little concessional capital as possible in a way that mobilizes as much commercial capital as possible. And you do this in areas where you would otherwise attract the least commercial capital. So how do we achieve maximum additionality and minimal concessionality? For this, we really need to address the third gap, which is the paucity of effective risk mitigation mechanisms and tools. We just need to build stronger muscles in de-risking. This will mean developing more granular and more regionalized risk analysis tools. This will also mean innovating with appropriate risk mitigation mechanisms. Let me offer 3 archetypes of further work that we should explore here. First, we can take legacy solutions that we're all familiar with, that the market is familiar with, and scale these. Relevant mechanisms in this category include currency hedging facilities to address local currency risk, or guarantees that mitigate credit or liquidity issues so that longer tenor financing can be extended. The second archetype of further work relates to data or research-focused initiatives, such as studies to identify optimal combinations of capital stacks that can enhance risk-weighted returns to maximize private capital mobilization. And thirdly and finally, we need to double down on the development of innovative risk financing solutions. One example in the emerging carbon capture segment is something that's being worked on by Howden in partnership with Scores Syndicate at Lloyd's. And they've launched a first-of-its-kind insurance facility covering the leakage of carbon dioxide from commercial-scale CCS facilities. So efforts like this actually support our de-risking work and can enable private capital to flow with confidence into crucial transition sectors, even where these are nascent and viewed as riskier. So this brings me to my last point. You may have noticed, I hope, our announcements at COP28 around the Financing Asia's Transition Partnership, or FASP. This is a blended finance initiative which aims to mobilize up to $5 billion to de-risk and finance transition and marginally bankable green projects in Asia. Now, FASP really seeks to address the three gaps or the three issues that I highlighted earlier: risk-tolerant capital, risk mitigation, and a risk-centric approach to partnerships. In case you missed the announcement, I just want to reiterate that the Singapore government has indicated that it is prepared to contribute concessional capital to support the partnership. And we really hope to mobilize a base of concessional capital for this platform, working with philanthropies, MDBs, and DFIs. We have gathered a strong cast of initial partners working across a number of areas that are important for the region: ADB, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GIAP, and the MAS have signed an MOU on Energy Transition Acceleration Finance, or ETAF. And this is really to collaborate on the early managed phase-out of coal, renewable energy, and grid modernization. The MAS has also signed an MOU with Allied Climate Partners, the World Bank's IFC, and Temasek. And this partnership will focus on green investments to target marginally bankable renewable energy projects and EV infrastructure. I've been really heartened by the interest in FASP and the traction that we have seen, but let me be clear, we need more partners and we need to extend the scope of the areas to be financed. With regard to areas, we are exploring ways to finance the industrial transformation, including the decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors. We also want to include emerging technologies such as hydrogen and CCUS. With regard to partners, we are currently in active discussions with potential anchor partners in addition to the ones that I mentioned earlier, such as MDBs and philanthropies. We would be keen to work with anyone in this room to help further this objective. So Bill, I'm doing what you do, right? Waving my hands around and saying, please, trust me. I'll end soon, but I just wanted to leave you with one last thought. Tiny but mighty. Of all the excellent content that was covered at the Philanthropy Asia Summit on Monday afternoon, some of you may have been there, tiny but mighty was the key idea that I took away. This phrase is really an excellent nod to the outsized impact that philanthropy can have, given the sector's deep expertise, its ability to leverage patient capital, and its willingness to take a much broader view on returns. Asian blended finance is similarly tiny but mighty. Volumes are growing from a low base, but the future that it can unlock for us and the region is powerful indeed. But for this future to be realized, we need to be mighty and not tiny in our ambitions as we move beyond awareness and effort to actual action and impact and much higher financing volumes. So by harnessing risk-tolerant capital, developing more effective risk mitigation mechanisms, and building risk-centric partnerships, I very much hope and I'm confident that we will achieve the very mighty scale that we need to catalyze an inclusive energy transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mason, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to try and accelerate this as much as possible to bring us back to time. Before I invite our distinguished panel onto the stage, I've been asked to take no more than 2 minutes to just help set the scene. And I thought to do that, I'm going to break character and step out of my neutral role as moderator and just show you my hand as to where my biases lie. And at the risk of being slightly provocative, I'd like to suggest to you that the missing P is not philanthropy. Now, before becoming an academic, and I'm an academic now, probably one of the very few ones that teach both sustainability and financial engineering in 2 different departments at the university. I was a professional in global markets, emerging markets, and so the language I speak is the language of demand and supply, demand of and structuring and derivatives, as opposed to the language of charity and grants. And I'll explain why I don't think the missing P is philanthropy, in the same way that I don't believe that philanthropy is an asset class. Philanthropy is an emotion. It's a passion. It's motivation and mission. But to give effect to that, you need conduits and channels. So philanthropy is not an asset class, but philanthropy-enhanced investment products can be an asset class, where the assets are defined like a marketable product and where they can be contextualized within the asset allocation framework of asset owners, in the same way that family offices are increasingly investing in hedge funds and private equity funds and so on and so forth. So the missing P is actually product, philanthropy-enhanced investment products. And when I say products, I mean both on the demand side and on the supply side of the equation. On the demand side, we have lots of projects, climate and nature projects, that are not ready to be invested into. So we need to turn them into investable products. And many of these are locally diverse, they're idiosyncratic, so it requires non-trivial skills to convert projects into products. On the supply side, we need investing products. So these are vehicles and conduits and funds that can aggregate small projects, that can help de-risk. These are individually pre-money risky projects that may be de-risked with the act of putting early stage money into it. You bring down the mortality of those projects. And then as aggregators, they spread that risks around. So you need that on the supply side as well. So that's my proposition. It's philanthropy-enhanced products that we need to do the hard yards of structuring in. And with that as a hypothesis, or as a contestable hypothesis, let's begin with the panel. So if I may just invite all of you to come up on stage, please. Dean, Kitty, Gilles, and Jin Young. I hope you're all here, please. So we have various parts of the ecosystem and certainly both the supply and demand side of that equation here. Let's start with Gilles, if I may, particularly with regards to your work with the project side of the equation. How do you prepare them and what do you identify as some of the gaps in this value chain right now?
Yeah, thank you, Lutfi, and good afternoon, everyone. So perhaps the best illustration, I'll refer to a piece of work, a research that we did a couple of months ago. We were commissioned by one of you, a philanthropy in the room, which I'm not going to name because I don't know if they want to be named, but they will speak a bit later. They might mention it. They wanted to understand why is the deployment of capital for renewable energy in Asia slower than we hope. So the idea was to go out and interview. We interviewed about 200 stakeholders in the region, talking to developer, to industry association, to lenders, and to try and understand, well, tell us what do you need to deploy more capital. Now, of course, the first reaction is to complain about the lack of government ambitious targets, the policies, lots of issues that are technical in nature. But on the financing side, we're basically saying, on the back end, when the projects are ready, there is no shortage of capital. Between commercial banks, the capital markets, multilateral development financial institution, that money was available when the project is ready to start construction. And they were saying, look, before the projects are ready to start construction, we technically spend a year, 2 years, and even more developing these projects. Because the development in Asia takes much longer, they were saying maybe twice or 3 times longer than in Europe. So we have capital that is stuck for longer, and the development is more expensive. Now, the energy transition is not started by the big corporates that have deep pockets. It's really small developers, entities that have skills, people, capabilities, but not necessarily a lot of money. So they were essentially saying the missing piece for us is early stage development capital. Now, I know I'm going to sound like I'm sending flowers to Mason to thank him for the invite, but there was even, I remember one interview when the developer said, we actually need more CCEF. We need more of Clime capital. And the study was only looking at solar and wind, and these are proven business model, right? But I think we can easily extrapolate that study when we talk about low carbon transition. We're talking about we're inventing new business models. Very often the companies, they are EBITDA negative. It's not about scaling up. It's actually trying to make something happen. So the risk is high. Going back to what Gillian mentioned, risk appetite. We are talking about high risk because it's not proven, and we're not talking about tremendous returns because this is not business where we're going to fund a hockey stick and get out at a billion times valuation. So early stage development capital, risk appetite, and multiplier effect, because eventually the blend, you're enabling these little projects, and on the back of it, commercial funding is available and will be there.
Can I just very quickly ask a follow-on? So you said there's no shortage of capital, but it looks like there is a shortage of risk capital.
Absolutely. So solar and wind, the business model are proven, right? It's been done for years, it works. So the capital, when the project is ready to build, is available. With a few exceptions, because the geographies included emerging Southeast Asia, developed North Asia. We studied Bangladesh and Pakistan, and for those countries, okay, there is no billions of dollars available on the back end, but you're right, it is risk appetite.
So thank you for that. So in your example, what I take away is that it's an example of philanthropy helping us just identify what the risks are. There's just a knowledge gap that needs to be unearthed. If I could come to you now, Jin Young from CIFF, if you could perhaps give us your perspective on how you've been involved with blended funds and what are the lessons learned.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I can really try to dive into missing P puzzle a little bit further from philanthropy perspective. Just putting a bit nerdy details on Bill's earlier comments and Gillian's, the really good, speech. So since 2015 Paris UN meeting, there has been a really strong drive to, the scale blended finance to meet sustainable development goals. So far, I think 198 billion was mobilized, but the reality is only 1% of it was put on climate. So climate blended finance is actually scarce. At the same time, the philanthropic giving have been growing massively, but so far the best number we got is 2% for annual giving given to climate. So overall, climate funding and climate blended finance is scarce. Then why that's the case? Philanthropic capital, the nature of philanthropic capital is very similar to MDB or DFI funding in terms of its concessionality. So its capital can easily transfer the risk return, the profile of the project to crowd in the private investors by observing more risk and less return. But for philanthropies, the more important than market return is as impact and additionality. impact profile, what philanthropy is really driving, especially those big bang philanthropy, is actually national level transition or sector level transition beyond specific projects. For example, institutional investors keep talking about, the investability, bankability of project and the lack of standardization or scalability in a certain market. Similarly, what philanthropy is looking at is scale of impact. That is actually scarce in terms of currently available project or project pipelines in developing countries and developing Southeast Asia. And another complication is the partner financiers, MDBs and DFIs. If you look at the entire investment portfolio of these key financiers, it's not yet fully transitioning from fossil. There is some ambiguity around this new clean opportunity and their ongoing, fossil investment. That's one of the challenges we are trying to tackle. And in terms of...
Sorry, it's ambiguity where? On the part of whom?
It could be a little sensitive, but the big, the financiers in the blended finance, for example, the ADB, IFC, and JICA, or these key financiers haven't yet fully, the transitions away from high carbon, the investment opportunities. That is actually true, and then many of philanthropic community have been really trying to have constructive conversation with these financiers. So that part I want to point out. And then in terms of additionality, philanthropic capital has unique ability to make large-scale grant. When we have this availability, without really, duplicating or crowding out other, the capitals, the law for including MDBs and also private sector, how, the philanthropists come in. That is a bit difficult part given current structure. But there is some emerging solutions. So the philanthropic capital can easily put on, for example, the first loss guarantees or design phase, grant for some of the financing facilities. But beyond that, the real risk in developing Southeast Asia is impact policy, the predictability and the rigorosity. So in that regard, also philanthropic capital, the grant-making capability can be also best utilized. For example, I'm getting back to also Mason as well. So the idea about technical assistance facility of a CSF from ecosystem perspective, of how the philanthropy work together with this institutional financiers, civil society, and government, and so on. So the philanthropic capital can be play also key role to reduce these uncertainties and really provide a stronger environment for all the other players, not just private investors, but MDB and DFI as well. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. So I guess the question for me always is, maybe I'll come back to you in the second round, is what you said makes perfect sense. Grant money, supposed to crowd in non-grant money. But we don't see that happening in scale. So the question isn't what needs to be done, it's why is it that what needs to be done does not get done? So I want to dig a bit deeper into what the blockages there might be. Well, you mentioned multiplier and the need for additionality and multiplier. And maybe, Kitty, I can bring you in over here. Yours is an energy alliance set up by several foundations. How do you look at ways to multiply your capital?
Thank you for the opportunity. So I want to say that if we kind of zoom in on the energy lens in the region, most of the ASEAN countries have made 2050 net zero targets. Currently, looking at the way we're financing the region, though, various different estimates stipulates that roughly $150 to $180 billion are needed every year, roughly in the next 5 to 6 years for us to really meet that target. With our current way of financing, we need to scale that by 5 to 6 times in order to hit that mark. And I think countries in ASEAN understand the challenge quite well. The governments are dealing with really a very tricky challenge in the sense that there is energy demand surge across the region in ASEAN. At the same time, there is the transition piece where the government have to be put to test to understand in this transition, how do you ramp down the fossil assets and how do you ramp up the renewable assets? And doing this in a way that doesn't tank your economy. It's a really tricky process. And I think the region is embarking on an unprecedented journey of deep decarbonization. And in this journey, there's no shortage of challenges that traditionally in the status quo, we never had to deal with this. And therefore, in order to address this, it requires really profound innovation to do problem solving. And I say innovation because that really kind of manifests itself in all across the way that we're dealing with things. I'm talking about innovation around technology, innovation around business model, innovation around policy. And in particular, maybe more relevant to today's occasion, is innovation around financing and the way we partner together. To rise to this challenge, we're looking at very different ways of addressing this. And GAP is born to creation by 3 strong backers to do tests and to do iteration. And blended finance has risen to the top as a very powerful tool to address the lack of financing and bringing people together. And I think for us, this is very much of a process of testing, iterate, learning, and then doing this in a loop. And Gillian mentioned earlier that roughly 2% of $800 billion philanthropic dollar goes out every year. As we're trying to figure out how to address the climate financing gap, the philanthropy world is going through their own testing iteration process in the sense that traditionally a lot of the grant making work, right? GAP does less of the grant making type of work. Our focus is much more around the participation, sometimes in the deal by deal type of participation where appropriate, sometimes more moving to the platform approach. But the traditional philanthropy are now figuring out in the climate agenda, when the poverty alleviation, education, gender, equality, natural disaster, a lot of this are merging under one big initiative and challenge, and that's the climate agenda. How to bring all these dollars together. And I think to bring the conversation back to GAP a little bit, the theory is really, we're trying to work together in a deeply open-minded way with all partners at the table to bend the economics of deals in a way that we cannot shy away from this and say, hey, wait a moment, someone is making money here. But in a way, really looking at the dollar that's going out and thinking, is this really the best use of our money from different lenses? Is it extracting carbon out of the atmosphere? Is it avoiding carbon? Is it creating access for people to have reliable, safe, affordable energy? Is it creating green jobs in the transition so the governments in this part of the world doesn't risk losing the capital, losing the jobs, and losing the economic competitiveness in this process? So I think one couple of things that we've learned is really kind of learning with the partnerships in this innovation, how we partner with everyone, testing with the capital to understand how to deploy capital of this nature, working widely with our peers in the area and really say, learn from the GAP experience, and this is how we can take the financing to the next level by being a philanthropist in this day and age.
Thank you for that. So it looks like it's highly contextual. There's a lot of case by case. And so scaling it in an industrial fashion is not that easy. Lots of sequencing and pacing in the transition. But I just wonder whether we could have a market over here between you and Gilles, right? So is there a way for them to de-risk some of the things that you were talking about? So I'd be very curious to know what happens in a conversation between the two of you. So maybe we'll come back to that later. But Dean, it's your turn now, and I think what we've heard several times so far is, how do we make nerdy great again? Blended has been a concept for some time, but to really give it effect, it has to be structured. So maybe you could talk us through that structuring exercise, what happens in the engine room, and maybe for the benefit of people who may not be familiar with CSEF, just a quick description of what exactly is that thing?
Well, let me start off by saying that when I was asked by Mason to speak on a panel about philanthropy, I said, hey, that's not me. But I'm very glad that the pivot we're talking about is actually product, because that is my bread and butter, setting up generally for commercial investors, private equity style investment funds. So, how do we structure? Well, I think the first point is we need some kind of ecosystem, and it can leverage off a lot of things that are already in existence. We're not completely reinventing the wheel, and maybe I'll come back to some historic things that have happened in this area before we even talked about something called blended finance. But the key thing I think really is that if you can think of a project in these terms, which is a single layer of philanthropy, which could encourage commercial investors to come in because it de-risks it, and then put that into a product where you've got a professional manager, and this is all they do day in, day out, a blind pool fund with some very clear criteria about what they should and should not be doing. That multiplier effect can be just much more profound, because you're de-risking the commercial investors within the fund product itself, and then that can be making investments which maybe you wouldn't do commercially in their own right, but with the the blended priorities going on, that can make it work for everybody in terms of their individual risk appetite. And then obviously you've got follow-on rounds later on from purely commercial investors. So, the effect can be really very profound in that respect. The second thing, and I think this touches a little bit on what Kitty just said, is there has to be, Mason calls it the secret sauce, and I don't know what the secret sauce is, but what are the ratios between the commercial investors and the philanthropists? I think what is clear is I don't think philanthropists want to be subsidizing in a major way governments. That's pretty clear to me. It doesn't mean they'll necessarily get exactly the same amount of upside, and maybe there is some kind of first loss, but certainly what we did on CCF2 is we had a ratio of 1-3 effectively. So, the junior capital was a quarter of the money going in. DFI and commercial money was the remaining 75%. And there's a priority in terms of how the money goes out, which means that the commercial investors get their money back first. But thereafter, everyone's really sharing in the profits. So it's trying to come up with something that works economically for everyone. And what that means in practice will depend product by product. If
did it require a lot of negotiations and iteration? It's going to be 20% 80 or 25% 75?
Yeah, the DFIs are horribly greedy. I mean, really. It started off at 20, and it crept up over time. And I make no apologies for saying that. I used to work for DFI. And so, but it will depend. If it's a debt product, it may look very different from an equity product. So it's going to change. It's going to take a lot of number crunching. I'm a lawyer. I don't crunch numbers. So that's for someone else. Look, there's a third point, and it's an important one, and I'm sorry if I'm getting into a sort of multilateral DFI bashing here. And
You're too far in now anyway, so just go ahead.
And I realise it may not make any difference, but I'm going for it anyway.
I can't de-risk this one, so please.
I don't need to de-risk it because most of them aren't my clients. So we raised, I want to compare two funds. One was a fund that raised $4 billion from 130 investors. One was CCF, which to date has 12 investors and raised $127 million. The legal spend is roughly the same on the two funds. The number of side letter provisions is virtually identical. What I would describe as the administrative inconvenience for CSEF is way higher than for this commercially oriented manager, way, way higher. We get into ESG policies. It's Article 8 under SFDR, so that in its own right has a whole bunch of reporting obligations. On top of that, there are 10 separate E&S standards which Clime need to adhere to. There's additional DFI and multilateral requirements. We had a gigantic battle where we got to a not entirely terrible place where we do now have a harmonized schedule, but that's not what the investors originally wanted. It was I had a full head of hair once upon a time. It was a battle to get everything to put into one schedule, because the problem we have is we have all these different standards and a lot of them are covering the same stuff, but you have a manager that needs to report differently to cover the same thing. And that is just ridiculous in the context of a fund of this size. Okay. It's just so time-consuming. I think the DFIs and the multilaterals need to come up with a very clear standard, just agreed, that will go into all fund documents that they go into. And I think that's going to make life a lot easier. We talk about barriers of entry being a good thing, and that is normally the case. But here we have barriers to entry which make raising funds like this very difficult. I had a potential client come in this morning, and they've raised 25 or 30 million that they want for a climate tech fund. And then they told me who the other 5 million was coming from. It was from one of the multilaterals, and they're already wanting lower fees than everybody else. I mean, this is $5 million. We're talking about a tiny amount of management fee, but they want to cut that management fee right down. And I just said, find your $5 million from someone else. I know this investor, and the administrative burden for you is going to be excessive.
Thank you, Dean. So I was a little surprised when I heard that, because I thought the bottleneck would be in the junior tranche, the philanthropy part of it, but looks like it's the upper chamber where, and we've heard it twice now, that there is either ambiguity in the stance towards transition finance, or there is administrative burden that is being put by the institutional investors, not the philanthropy leg. I'm going to come back to you again on the structuring part, because I really want us to, I'm baffled as to how we can't make this whole area of blended finance a little bit more sexy. How can crypto and Dogecoin and NFTs and all those guys get so much airtime and not this? So maybe there is something in the structuring that could make it a bit more attractive. But Jinying, if I could come to you again, please. So how do we move this market? How do we scale it up?
Thanks. So we really need to tackle the barriers here, and also the barriers could be of perception or a lack of the understanding each other. So, and also I want to emphasize the partnership and also innovation further. So it's not just about looking at one vehicle, but actually what's going behind that. I would bring back again the word of ecosystem. That's really, really critical. CSF is our, very proud, the success story. But there is also the big, the global level momentum around the allied climate partners really, replicate scale CSF success into other regions as well. And underlying that drivers. So we are also thinking, what are the key ingredients to make this, the blended finance to work? So it's it's not just about structuring the finance vehicle itself, but the underpinning, the enabler. So the CSF example, CSF is really driving innovative, the business model in RE, and batteries. But there is other very close sibling partner who's gonna talk later. For example, the ETP, so they are working on shaping policies in Vietnam and Indonesia and Philippines. So that comes together. And we have brilliant, the Regional Climate Foundation, TARA. So TARA is really driving political will of Southeast Asia so that the country have firm, sustained will. So direction is not just about one, the project opportunity, but it's really about the countries and region, the transition. So I would say us being more, the innovative thinking around what's behind that, then I think philanthropy capital can be really unlocked. So we can do many, many things, not just putting our money as the first loss,
Right.
the guarantee or some of the grant portion of the vehicle, but far beyond that, all the needed, the gap to be bridged.
Right. So building an ecosystem, developing a new market really is not, it's not something you do in one shot. I guess you have to turn the flywheel a few times. How should I be reading the amount of time we have left? Should I go to questions from the audience now, or are we over time? Can I ask if there are questions from the audience? Either on... So again, the thing about CSEF, I was pleasantly surprised to learn that it's 75-25. I've seen others, so this is a proper blended product. I've seen others that are more like Nutella. You think it's blended chocolate, but actually it's sugar and palm oil, and there's a tiny bit of chocolate in there. Yeah.
Maybe while we're waiting for someone to type in a question, I just want to very quickly kind of go back to what we're talking about, how to scale this, maybe from the perspective that if I ask everyone here to imagine that you're going back to your previous memory of doing any type of group dance or sports. So imagine you're still doing that, but instead the rules are changed. But instead of having a clear set of rules that you know how to play the game now, you don't really know, something about the rules, but it's still kind of being shaped. And you're trying to find that position in a soccer field or whichever field that you may be dancing or doing sports. So I think what we're also trying to do collectively is building muscle memory and trying to recognize everybody come to the table with needs and interests. And sometimes fiduciary duty they need to fulfill. And B, understanding we have the same commitment and we're at the table for the same reason. And C, acknowledging that and working together to be able to provide comfort and making this kind of like a well-oiled machine going forward.
Right. That's very relevant to the question we have. So, I mean, my question would have been, is it more like jazz or is it more synchronized dancing? But this one is relevant. So how do we design good program governance for blended financing to ensure that all partners are being heard and that they can fully participate in the decision-making process? Who'd like to take this? I guess, either of you two as ecosystem developers. What is the process right now to make sure there's good governance?
I think you're looking to me here. Look, I can only really talk about it in the context of funds because that's my area. But so let me focus there. Look, decisions get made at different points in the process. So, there's a product and it's got some very clear guidelines about what it can and can't do. And I think for investors, subject to some caveats, that should be a one-off decision. Do we like this manager? Do we like what they're doing? Do we agree with what's in the documents? And obviously, there would be some changes to those documents along the way. Beyond that, I think it's over for the manager to get on and do their thing. Yes, there should be reporting, and yes, obviously they should be speaking to their investors on a very regular basis, or of whatever nature, whether philanthropists or more commercially oriented. And the ultimate sanction for a manager, and the very easy sanction, is if they don't do a great job, they don't get to raise their next fund, and so on. And that's the real driver. We can get very intensely involved in the terms, and we can have a lot of what I would describe as sort of additional governance. But I think a lot of it just slows the process down. We don't need the 10 commandments.
Do you not see the other side of the argument, which is that if it turns out there's an incident of poor governance and a scandal breaks out, it harms not just that fund, but it contaminates the whole sector and sets us all back again.
Of course, which is about due diligence on the way in, which is about having mechanisms, as we always do, within the documentation. So, yeah, normally there are mechanisms which say we can remove a manager if they've committed calls. There's a thing that we call no-fault divorce, where a manager can get removed as well. But look, what I was going to say is we don't need the 10 Commandments to know that we shouldn't be killing people. So let's not overly manage the managers. Let's provide real support. Let's help them develop. And I know, you know, Mason's got a number of investors who are providing real on-the-ground advice and support in terms of their investment activities and their reporting activities. But, you know, you've got to trust them to do their job.
Yeah, perhaps I would just add a little bit on this. I mean, we're not inventing new ways of managing and investing money, right? Technical assistance and grant money have been in existence for a long time from multilaterals and DFIs. I'm not going to comment on whether it's effective or whether they're hard to manage, but it exists. It comes with a lot of strings attached. And that's why philanthropy starting to do this for low carbon solutions can be another avenue, right? It just multiplies the supply. And on the fund management, again, fund managers have existed for a long time. It's difficult to raise a first fund. Then, you know, the fund manager establish its credentials and do this again and again. So we are at the starting, but we're not doing anything new. And then we have platforms and we learn from each other. So I'm an optimist, and this, I wouldn't see the risk, I would see the opportunities. And we're all looking at, you know, funding low carbon solutions.
Right. Any of you would like to add any more points on the governance issue? Does it concern any of you?
I can briefly mention, just also responding to your earlier comments on complementarity between different philanthropies. So even philanthropies, maybe not the risk-return profile, but also the impact, you know, the profile, what we really looking for, you know, an opportunity in Southeast Asia climate project could be slightly different. So definitely we can be quite complementary. So the success of the governance could be also the mixing up the different, you know, the risk return and also impact profile altogether, even the philanthropic size and the really maximize the, you know, the philanthropic contribution there. So that hasn't been yet tried, but we are talking to each other to find the scale of, you know, the opportunity amongst ourselves. So it's a bit, you know, diverge from the question itself, but I would say, you know, the right, you know, the combination of different partners, even amongst the philanthropists who can take on different, you know, the roles, I would say.
Okay. All right. Yes? We have only 1 minute, so very quickly. I don't need a mic. Just tell me what the question is.
First of all, Justin Locke, RMI, very interesting panel. I think my question is, obviously, blended finance has a very critical role in catalyzing the commercial market. But we've seen in other markets, right, what is that sign or that tipping point where you have become a commercial market and blended finance actually becomes part of the problem, right? Where the market starts to get used to these instruments, right? And requires them. What is that
right
at the tail end?
So is it the crutches, the training wheels? When do the training wheels come off because the market has taken off on its own? Yeah. So the question is, when does blended finance, particularly the concessionary, if there is concessionary funding, which might be propping up others, when does the other part of the business becomes commercially viable so you don't really need that support anymore? And if you don't remove it, then are you just perpetuating that dependence? Is that the question you're asking? My gut feeling is we're nowhere near there yet at this stage. It's probably too premature, but do you guys have a view?
I mean, you take the example of renewable energy. It's a well-trodden business plan now. When the moment the project is ready for construction, it is ready for commercial funding. with the exception of frontier markets, as I mentioned, Bangladesh or Pakistan or some other difficult. But this is a proven business case. If we take another example of oil recycling or cooking oil recycling in Indonesia, I was working with a company that had negative EBITDA, but clients, customers, suppliers, but still turning negative EBITDA. And at one point, it went positive EBITDA, and that's when the commercial market was ready. So you could say do you have a proven business plan or not? And I would say that's probably the tipping point from my perspective.
With the view of working ourselves out of a job, that's the eventual goal. Keeping pulse with the market, understanding how the current deals are structured, what's market viable or not.
Right. And with that, we've come to the end of our time. So thank you very much to members of the panel, and thank you all for your time. It is time for a break.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll make a brief intro for the different panelists who will be sitting today in this session, starting with Gunilla Nelson. Gunilla is the head of the energy and climate investment sector at Swedfund, the Swedish development finance institution. Swedfund invested in CSEF2 as a part of Swedfund's focus on financing scalable climate projects in Southeast Asia. Gunilla Nelson, will you be coming to the stage? Next, I want to introduce Felix Barwenik. Felix is a senior investment manager at Swedfund, at Norfund, the Norwegian development finance institution. Norfund's investment in CSEF2 was through its climate investment fund, looking to fit the strong strategic fit and in terms of sector focus and geography with CSEF2. Felix, will you join us? Next on stage, I would like to call Matthew Thurnston, Head of Sustainability at REI, an outdoor retail cooperative based in Seattle, US. REI invested in CSEF2 as a part of their global decarbonization efforts. Matthew, will you join us? And finally, I would like to introduce Ryan Wagner. Ryan is the Head of Infra and Climate Funds at BII, the UK Development Finance Institution. BII invested into CSEF2 as a part of their organization's climate focused re-entry into Southeast Asia. Ryan, will you join us? So mostly DFIs. Thank you, Dean, for the compliments earlier. Yes, so I'll start the first question towards Ryan. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this investment was sort of a re-entry for you into the Southeast Asia market. We understand that BI wants to become more active in Southeast Asia. Could you explain the gaps that BI sees in the region that BII and blended finance could help unlock?
Thanks. Nice to be here with everyone. So BII, the UK's development finance institution, to give a bit of background here, we're the world's oldest DFI. We were set up in 1948, so we've been with emerging markets for the past 75 years. We've been investing in Africa, in South Asia. We were at one point investing in China, Latin America, Southeast Asia. Our mandate had really been development, impact, and poverty alleviation, measured through job creation, measured through private sector development. At some point in time, sort of in the early 2000s, Southeast Asia was deemed as being sort of sufficiently developed from a impact perspective as we measured it. So we pulled away from Southeast Asia, China, a number of other markets, and focused on really the poorest countries in the world in Africa and in South Asia. A few years ago, when we had a refresh of our strategy, as we do every 5 years, the UK government, our shareholder, FCDO, looked at Southeast Asia and said there is a climate emergency, not only in the world, but in Southeast Asia, and we can do something about it. And so they gave us a mandate and quite a bit of capital to look at Southeast Asia. So we re-entered a couple years ago. Our idea was to start with funds. That would be a good way to get our feet wet, and then continue on with some other products such as direct equity and debt So we're beginning our journey. We set up an office here, and we're probably learning from a lot of the other DFIs and other investors in the region as to where those gaps are. We see the tailwinds that are behind each of the markets and in the climate space, in terms of the demographics, in terms of the demand, in terms of the need, the government programs like JET-P. So we do see that area as opportunity. We do see structural issues where there are policies and regulations and reforms that are needed. A lot of those are underway, but maybe not quite there yet or haven't been proven out. And so I think that's where there's the opportunity for blended finance and where bridges to the gaps can be made. So I think the professor mentioned it before, but I think a lot of the gaps are in the products and needing solutions. So people to provide solutions like Clime Capital, thinking through ways that they can aggregate and bring capital together, because I think the capital will be there. I think there's, as we're talking about through this whole conference, various providers that can come to the table, structuring, making sure that there's a good alignment. I think those are the things that we'll need to see. But I think there are some structural issues that the sort of form of capital and the capital coming together can help solve.
Thank you, Ryan. Linking to that on blended finance, question for Gunilla. How does the blended finance structure help sweat fund get comfortable with the early stage risk return strategy of CSEF2?
Yeah, so in terms of sweat fund strategy, we are very similar to BII in the sense that we have a strong focus on financing projects that lead to climate mitigation and adaptation. And I think that given that climate change is really a global concern, we try to look at it in a bit of a holistic manner. And I think that what's really struck us during the time here at this event is that there are so many interesting opportunities. It's such a thriving sector. And to some extent, it really is about how can we ensure that there is more capital coming to the sector. Because, again, as the previous panel emphasized, there is a gap, there's a persistent financing gap, and we need to do what we can do to enable private capital to get on board. We don't provide subsidies. We are more of a patient investor, so we actively look for structures whereby our presence and the blended finance sort of structuring enables private capital to get on board. And I think that the other thing that I want to say is that from our point of view, attracting private capital is not just in terms of getting the financing, but it really is also about having knowledge sharing between DFIs and the private sector. It's so easy just to look at the numbers, the dollar signs, but at the same time, there's so much innovation, and we actively want to see private investors come also from the innovative angle. And that's really one, I'd say, sort of the main reason why we are looking at these the blended finance vehicles.
Thank you, Gunilla. Moving from one Nordic DFI to the other one, to Felix. What is Norfund's approach in supporting blended finance funds? Is philanthropy the missing P that could unlock more funds to accelerate the low carbon transition?
So Norfund has previously participated in blended finance structures, but similar to Swedfund, we provide capital at commercial terms, so we don't provide any subsidized financing as Norfund ourselves. But we have, for example, with NORAD, the Norwegian Agency for Development Corporation, share development costs with them for early stage renewable energy projects where they, I guess, provide the subsidized funding. We also recently invested in the Green Guarantee Company on the LSE, which provides guarantees for borrowers in developing countries to improve their credit rating, to access international capital. So that's together with a number of other development agencies. And obviously we invest in funds such as CSEF2, which have blending components. But again, that blending does not come from us. And we definitely think that philanthropy can play a role here. I think traditionally it's been donor countries providing that kind of funding, and there's a role for philanthropy to come in, as we've seen or heard in the previous discussion as well.
Yep. Thank you, Felix. I think one of the key things that like DFIs usually want to achieve through their investments is mobilization. And what Gunilla has also previously mentioned, that private sector mobilization is quite key for us. That links to the question towards Matt. REI is one of the first corporate investors in CSEF2. Could you explain what attracted REI to CSEF2? How important was the first loss blended tranche in your investment decision making?
Yes, it's first a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm admittedly a bit of a fish out of water. We are a different organization than the DFIs here on stage. But that's the point. I think about Professor Siddiqui, what you said earlier about having a foot in the world of the sustainability space, which is my home, and then a foot in the world of the investment space. And our thesis is that we need much more of that. So REI, if you're not familiar, we are an outdoor retail company. We're a cooperative. We're based in North America. We're actually the largest consumer-owned cooperative in North America. And we sell outdoor products for muscle-powered activities. So think bikes, tents, sleeping bags, kayaks. The organization has a really unique mission on behalf of the 23 million members who all co-own it, and that is to connect every person to the power of the outdoors and engage them in the fight to protect it. So underneath that comes a really ambitious set of climate commitments that we've made on behalf of our membership and the cooperative, and that applies to our own footprint. It also applies to our global value chain. Southeast Asia is where we manufacture a significant portion of our products. So when we think about our responsibility, our accountability as a corporate actor, we look at this region as an area where we need to move further and faster, and we need to do that through partnerships. So that's what brought REI into this conversation as an LP in CSEF2. And for us, it's really an opportunity to both accelerate the broader improvements and investments that we need to see. We've thrown around different statistics today, but IMF and IEA are calling for $5 trillion of climate investment per annum by 2030. And importantly, a huge jump in the amount of private sector capital that needs to go into that, from about 40% to 90%. So we see a huge need for blended finance. But to your question, this is, for us, it's not our core competency as an organization, right? We are a retail organization. We run stores and distribution centers, and we connect people to the outdoors through products and experiences. So for us to get treasury dollars mobilized in this space, we need to do that with confidence that we have a prospective return and some safety that would be within the ballpark of for us opening another store and bringing our co-op to an additional community. So having that first loss tranche in this blended finance structure, critically important, and that was one of the things that brought REI to the table. And our hope is that additional corporates will be able to soon follow, thanks to the leadership of organizations who sit in that first loss tranche.
Thank you, Matt. Going back to Gunilla, obviously CO2 mitigation and renewable energy generation are key measures of impact, but what are other areas of impact that Sweat Fund looks into when making an investment decision making?
Yeah, we look at, we look at climate in all of our investments, and we say that we use a climate lens whenever we assess anything. And that means that, for example, when we provide long-term financing to banks, which is something else that we do, we also try to see, is there a way for us to earmark this funding so that it goes to companies engaged in the green economy? We also, for example, make investments in the food sector, and there we actively look to make investments that have a climate mitigation or adaptation aspect to it. Because I think sometimes it's so easy to think about climate as being this sort of techy, innovative, new things, but you can get a lot of climate bang for the buck by making investments that are quite ordinary, but greening them somewhat. And to that extent, we are actively looking at ways in which we can aggregate these kinds of investments. And I think that's also somewhere where blended finance can come in, because anything that enables us to aggregate climate investments and making these sorts of investments more attractive for investors is positive. So don't just look for techy climate things, also look for climate in the more sort of ordinary course of business.
Thank you, Gunilla. I think one of the growing part of this sector is the fact that there is an innovation on how to monetize the different generation not just the electricity, but how do you put it into numbers? And that links to my next question towards REI, towards Matt. We understand that REI is taking a special lead role in helping Clime Capital with carbon credits and RECs. Could you elaborate on this? And also, do you think blended finance and a focus on carbon credits and RECs could unlock more corporates to come into these kind of investments?
It'd be a pleasure to talk about this. And as a corporate sustainability professional, it's been lovely to sit in a room where the conversation does not center around terms like scopes 1, 2, and 3. But many of you are probably familiar with that space. And if you're not, I think it's coming very rapidly. The way that we think about this is we have our scope 3, so our value chain footprint, and we have an ambitious science-based target to go and reduce emissions in that global value chain, both upstream and downstream. A huge amount of the work that we do is therefore directly with our manufacturing partners to help them through energy efficiency, procuring rooftop solar, making investments that allow them to decarbonize their business, and therefore the products that we are bringing to our customers. But we can't match every ton of emissions in our value chain with a specific supplier and or with the leverage to go and get those reductions. So we also need to begin thinking about how do we make these regional investments in a way that is still tied to market-based instruments that allow us to demonstrate progress and additionality. So one of the unique features of CCEF2 is the ability to, for LPs like REI, to receive returns not just in financial returns, but also in the form of EACs or environment attribute certificates. So think clean electricity and the rights to that, think carbon credits and the rights to that through verification processes. So for us, that was a hurdle in order for us to engage, because otherwise there's no necessarily cause for a corporate like us to be engaging in this. But if we can begin to demonstrate measurable value chain improvements, it allows us to move in that direction. And this is if I can wax poetic for just one more second, this is a huge challenge and a massively untapped opportunity where my world and this world collide. If you look at the Science Based Targets Initiative as the global standard, we've seen a 500% increase in SBTI commitments over the last 5 years. So huge. But we are 2 orders of magnitude below that in terms of corporate investments in clean energy solutions. So there is a massive gap between corporate climate commitments and actually putting the wood behind the arrow to bring those to life in terms of the dollars. So this was a unique feature of CCEF, but one for us that we think is important and has a real opportunity to potentially scale and mobilize a huge amount of corporate treasury dollars that are sitting on the sidelines looking for a way in. And last thought on this is you're seeing a little bit of movement in the SBTI that might actually allow corporates to credit these types of investments and instruments against their value chain. So more to come on that, but that could potentially really create an avalanche of additional capital in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. I think this is a very exciting, large potential to bringing a lot more capital into this space, especially for companies to really get to net zero. These kind of instruments would be really, really helpful. Question for Felix. How is Norfund thinking about blended finance in emerging markets? Could philanthropy play a bigger role in the region through similar funds? And what about in other emerging low-income countries?
So again, I think blended finance can undoubtedly play a role in positively contributing to development. But I think there's also pitfalls, and I think we had the last question in the previous panel that I guess touched a little bit upon that. But first of all, maybe the benefits. So the sustainability goals cannot be achieved without significant increased investments in infrastructure and private sector development. I think everyone in this room is aware of that. And the need of this is obviously greater in the poorest countries. And blended finance can mobilize more private capital towards developing countries. And we've seen it in CCEF and we've seen it elsewhere. But of course, I think one of the questions here is also, how do you define blended finance? And as I said before, previously I think it was just used anywhere where there is public capital and private capital coming together. Whereas I think now we look at it more as kind of subsidized versus commercial capital. Anyway, both are there to catalyze private capital. And it's been around for a long time. It's nothing new, and I think it's going to be around for a much longer time. To me, at least, the philanthropy angle is a little bit newer, but maybe someone else knows a little bit more about the history there. As the last question from the previous panel touched upon, though, I think one of the dangers of blended finance is that it can crowd out private capital. There can be a race to the bottom where too much subsidized funding is available. It can be too generous, where maybe the benefits go towards private investors. I mean, you wouldn't want maybe some private capital subsidizing the Norwegian government. In this case, it may look a bit odd. Or it goes maybe to some fund managers rather than towards the development aspect. I'm not saying that's the case here in CSF at all in either of those comments, but I just wanted to also give you the other side of the coin. And I think these blended finance structures need to be managed well and efficiently allocate capital. So that's one of it. And I think back to one of Gilles' comments earlier, the most efficient use of subsidized capital is probably aimed at this early stage development, bring it to a commercial stage where commercial capital is willing to invest. And I think that's where we really see the gap and where this capital can play the biggest role. And yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Felix. I mean, we have heard in the previous session, and it's something I often hear, that DFIs can be quite difficult to manage and do investments with. But they also play a very important role in catalyzing and bringing new models and structure into the market. Question to Ryan regarding this. When you think of the role of philanthropy, DFIs, and private sector, how have DFIs helped lead the efforts for the formation of CSF2?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe it's helpful here to give a bit of background for how we came to invest in CSF2. I remember meeting Mason and Josh, I think it was April of 2022. We were out here for the first time. Singapore had just kind of reopened since COVID. And we were on a business development trip to look at funds out here. And our first thought was, this is interesting. These guys might have something here. However, look, the first fund was 20 million. Are they really going to get to 150 million? So we kind of gave it a look and we said, well, we'll see if other DFIs are interested. So with some other discussions being had, there was other interest, but we weren't sure it was going to catalyze and other forms of capital were going to come along, whether the first loss would come in as they had wanted, whether commercial investors would take a look at this. And then we saw other groups like Allied Climate Partners and others getting interested. And so we said, look, this is going to catalyze other investors, not just DFIs, but maybe we can be the piece in the middle to help get this together. And then commercial investors will come. Having the first loss in place early on really helped to move things along quite quickly. So yeah, we really at first didn't think it would kind of get there. Now at 127, well on its way to 175, I think it's a real success story and we'd like to see it replicated elsewhere. But I think DFIs can be that piece in the middle. I think Dean left the room here, but I know we can be painful. We ask for a lot. A lot of us have different interests and different metrics and things that we need to report and measure back to our shareholders. And a lot of us represent taxpayer money in our respective countries. So with that, we have a duty of care and responsibility that we carry through investments to the best of our ability. And we're in risky markets. We're doing tough things, and there's been accidents in the past and things that have happened. So we need to be mindful of ways that we can protect that capital. But I think, yeah, DFIs can play a role to bring groups together here.
Absolutely, and I think also to really make blended finance work, what needs to be on focus is that incentives are aligned. There are different parties with different risk-return profiles, different appetites, and if we can really align their interests and incentives, then more and more of these structures will come into the market. We don't have much time left. It's around 3 minutes. Would one of you want to touch on one of the questions that are coming up at Slido?
I think one thing I want to mention on this third question. So BII can provide concessional capital, and so we're seeing where this subsidized and commercial capital mixing, because we won't blend just for ourselves, but we'll use concessional capital. We didn't in the case of CCEF2 because there was enough already there, but I think creating that alignment, like you're mentioning, that's very important. So structures that there might be different risk levels, but where the overall outcomes are well aligned. I think between the manager and the various investors, I think you need to see that. Otherwise, you will have conflicts along the way, and there will be challenges.
And maybe one more thing that I would like to add on that one. I think one thing that we really like about CCEF2 is whereas commercial capital providers get their money first, but once they have got their money, everyone gets the same profit. So it's all in the same level of return, which makes conflicts less probable in this kind of situations. Maybe one final question. We've got 2 minutes left. Would one of you want to touch on the first question? What frameworks benchmark is used in determining structure is blended finance?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we talk about blended finance, people think that there's some sort of subsidy involved, and that's not necessarily the case. I think that to us, oftentimes blended finance structures is just a way of getting together with investors who have different kinds of risk appetites to make sure that you have a total pool of capital that is bigger than it otherwise would be. So I think it's really important to not necessarily equate blended finance with any kind of subsidy, but it's just it really is a way of scaling total investment and contributing to capital mobilization, and that's why it can be such a powerful tool, specifically, for example, in climate finance.
And the one thing, and back to the solutions point that has been made a few times, I think different forms of blending and different forms of concessional capital will need to be mixed with funds. In terms of, people are thinking first loss in a lot of these cases, but I think it can be viability gap funding on projects, it can be return enhancement, it can be different forms of trying to mobilize other investors. So I think being creative with how concessional or blended capital comes together, I think will be very important as well. So we shouldn't just think of it as first loss in the structuring.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there could be also instances where there are types of projects or sectors or technology which are very difficult to develop, and then commercial capital might find it difficult to put the capital in there, and that's where philanthropy could have a very big role. We've got like 20 seconds left, so I guess we can close it for now. Thank you all.
Can I just invite all of the panelists to come join me on stage? It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and it's been an honour to work with the Clime team to date. And I think this is a really exciting conversation to have, because we all understand that we have a crisis on our hands, but we need to have more nuanced conversations about social and financial returns and what does this really mean in practice. And technical assistance is one of the key drivers to a just transition. And hopefully that's some of what we're really going to tackle in this conversation. I'd love to start by inviting the High Commissioner Alistair Cox to come up, and before we really dig into the details about technical assistance, to talk about why Southeast Asia is so important to the Australian government.
Well, thank you very much, Miliana, and it's a great pleasure to be here at this forum this afternoon. I might also say on technical assistance in Southeast Asia, Australia has been working in Southeast Asia to advance the region's development goals for decades, since the over the last decade, since the 1960s especially. And throughout that time, through our aid programs, technical assistance has played an absolutely vital role at that upstream end of infrastructure development to seed the skills and the capacities that are so critical to the development of infrastructure in this region. And this is an enormously growing region, but it is one now which we're seeing is being one of the largest CO2 emitting regions alongside that growth with the Middle East. I think the statistic is that there's been a six-fold increase in coal-fired power in Southeast Asia alongside its growth since the year 2000 to now. So in the next phase of infrastructure development in Southeast Asia, low emissions growth is going to be vital, and replacing many of it, a lot of young coal-fired power particularly, is going to be absolutely critical. And so, and the amount of finance that we've been able to bring to the task through development capital from major partners globally, the World Bank, ADB, AIIB and others, is going to be, the need is far exceeded what we've been able to do to date. So private capital, together with a range of other capital sources is critical. But it can't just be done all from the outside. The skills need to be developed and upgraded in the region. And that's where technical assistance comes in so critically. It's developing the skills in the systems of the countries themselves to be able to do this. So I think we've always been a believer in the Australian government in building the skills indigenously to do this kind of capital development in the country's own ability. And I think that's been critical. But now as we move to the blended finance era, I think it's going to be absolutely critical to help in the new skills in understanding how to de-risk, for example, the involvement of private capital, how to create the first end losses, how to develop programs that make investment bankable. I think some of these are not necessarily the skill sets that have been in some of the large utilities and other state corporations around the region to think about that. And you can see that as I've been in Vietnam and Indonesia. I've had 2 postings there. And in the project work we see, we've always seen over the last more than 15 years, we've seen a lot of bold talk about PPPs, and governments are constantly saying, oh, the PPP will address that. But I mean, the point is the government sort of is looking at that as a panacea because it will somehow help their own state position to finance these assets. But the private part of it needs to have a bankable return. So, there are no panaceas without understanding the way that you need to create bankable investments that where some of these front-end risks are taken account of. And that's going to be particularly critical now in the blended finance world. So some of what we've been doing in the Australian government on technical assistance is something that we now need to take forward as we work with blended finance partners to help to generate the new capital that's needed. An enormous task, as we've been discussing today, for this energy transition. So I hope that just opens the way a bit.
Fantastic. And there are, I think, some really great points that will come back out throughout the panel. So interestingly, there's a study that shows that 63% of blended finance transactions that have TA1 are benefiting underserved or low-income populations. And we know that the energy sector actually receives the highest amount of technical assistance. So I think this sort of sets us up really well for thinking about this conversation. Philip, I guess I'd love to start with you and telling us a little bit around, in your experience, like why technical assistance is particularly needed in Southeast Asia for the low-carbon transmission.
So yeah, TA, I've been working development for 40 years and I can't think of any really good quality development intervention I've been involved with that was prepared without TA. So I think in a sense, for those of us from the development world, it's kind of self-evident. But in energy transition space, there are several uses of TA. I mean, the obvious one, and I think we're going to go on to talk about that later, is project preparation. Shovel-ready projects don't just fall out of the sky. They need a lot of preparatory work, ESG, feasibility studies, EIAs, and all that. But then there are less obvious things, which is what we do in ETP. For example, taking out or reforming unhelpful policies. So grid codes that have to be adapted to renewables. Then there's de-risking. So there's been a lot of talk of de-risking today. Some of the de-risking can be done through TA, through working with financial institutions, for example. Then we work on smart grids. And then there's a whole lot around knowledge and awareness and capacity building, particularly amongst the core people in governments who are actually driving policies. So let me stop there for the moment. Thanks.
And thank you for that. I guess for those that aren't familiar, we've just started to name this idea of kind of pre-investment technical assistance and post-investment technical assistance, and this idea behind market building and market shaping versus post-investment technical assistance, which is really around accelerating those business operations and creating greater social outcomes for the investments themselves, just for a bit of context setting. Jamie, the TARA Foundation is very experienced in this area. I guess we'd love to hear more around what do your efforts look like? You know, what are some of those lessons learned for having done this for many years now?
Thank you so much for having me. So TARA Climate Foundation, we're headquartered right here in Singapore, and we are a philanthropic foundation that is solely dedicated to accelerating energy transition and climate action right here in Asia. So we have been independently set up since 2 years ago, but actually our history goes back for about 10 years. So a bunch of philanthropists got together about 10 years ago and started looking at where are the areas that will have the biggest amount of emissions coming up in the future. And they realized that Southeast Asia and South Asia was one big carbon bomb, just ticking carbon bomb, but there's so little to no philanthropic funding coming into this region. That's how the idea of TARA came about. And we operate as a pooled fund, which means that we have about 20 global foundations that are giving money through TARA, and they're trusting us to basically spend the money and spend it well. And last year, we gave away about 300 grants, mostly to homegrown organizations, as well as corporations, as well as initiatives. You'll notice one of the themes from the past 2-3 days has been that philanthropy comes in many shapes and sizes. And we essentially see our role as helping build the ecosystem. So helping build the enabling infrastructure environment, enabling environment infrastructure. So one of the things that we've talked about the past few days is, yes, we need a lot of money to flow, but for the money to flow, there has to be a certain level of regulatory environment. A lot of barriers, whether they're technical or social or political, have to be removed. Who are the actors in this region who can actually work on that? So that is the business that TARA is in. So in practical terms, what that means is that we have been providing funds to Asian think tanks and research centers that are doing evidence-based work, who are doing policy engagement. We have supported things like the ASEAN Taxonomy Secretariat, because governments are usually not set up to provide funding for coordinating bodies like secretariats. And we have also spent a lot of time on nurturing the talent pipeline so that people who are working on climate can get paid for it. One thing I'd like to highlight is the amount of time we spent on incubation. So the business, climate is a nascent area of work in this region. So there's a lot of gaps in the ecosystem when you're looking for folks to do technical assistance. You simply sometimes cannot find them. So over the last 3 years, we have seeded about 20 different new organizations as well as initiatives. This includes things like setting up an independent energy think tank in South Korea, seeding funding to set up industry platforms on offshore wind in the places like Philippines, supporting the launch of corporate coalitions and more. And we see TA as one of the many levers, but a very important lever that we need to push for.
Thank you so much. And I believe one of the panelists earlier had indicated that technical assistance looks very different, and there's questions around effectiveness and efficiency and the costs associated with it, and structuring it is complicated, and it has to be very fit for purpose, I think, to be effective. Kevin, you've gone through this experience. Obviously, it'd be great to hear more around kind of bringing one to life for the audience.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Trisector is a non-profit investment bank of sorts, supported by the Economic Development Board of Singapore and Temasek Trust. And what we do is we help to structure different types of instruments to solve some of the problems related to having the private sector and government sector work together with philanthropy. So we do it across different issues, climate, health, and social. And what that means is we end up with a bit of a first principles approach to each of these things. So we actually launched one of the first recyclable technical assistance facilities for nature-based solutions in Southeast Asia. And maybe one way into that is to ask the question, I think someone asked earlier, what is blended finance? The way we think about it is, what is the problem, what's the obstacle that is stopping private sector investment? And one obstacle that everyone's talked about is risk. But there are other obstacles too, which I think our previous panelists hinted at. So this started because one of the conservation organizations came to us and said, we'd like to do a blended finance project for the mangroves we're trying to save in Indonesia. By the way, what is blended finance and how should we go about it, right? So we had to look at 9 different forms of blended finance. And what we realized was that basically the problem wasn't risk, but a mandate issue, where many of the investment funds are set up to invest in shovel-ready projects, but they're not set up to go ahead and prepare the projects for investment. And so what happens is that then the investment funds say, actually, there's not enough pipeline for me to invest in. So the role of the blended finance instrument in this case was to set up a technical assistance facility. We got about $7 million US from different family offices to go first, prepare the projects for shovel readiness, and then feed it to the investment funds. But because here it wasn't really an economics issue, it was more a mandate issue, so we could actually charge the funds to replenish the TA facility such that every time they paid for it, they invested in it, they would actually top up the fund. So this is more recyclable and more sustainable. And that also helped to address some of the problems around the question that sometimes comes up in blended finance, which is why should the philanthropic sector be subsidizing the private sector, right? So if we're very clear about what exactly the problem is we're trying to solve, then I think we can tailor exactly the type of blended finance solution to that. And so in this case, the TA fund solved the mandate issue rather than the risk issue. Thanks.
And I think there's this element as well here, picking up on the idea of kind of the public good in these kinds of blended finance facilities and technical assistance facilities. It is about market building that can benefit a wide variety of actors. And Jamie, some of the things that you mentioned fundamentally create, greater networks, organizations. It's facilitating more than just good business. I mean, Jamie, deferring to you, I'd love to hear more about some of the work of Tara Foundation and maybe hearing more about some of this, an exciting thing on the horizon.
Sure. I think I can provide 2 examples around technical assistance that we've been involved in recently and involving many of us actually today in this room. So I think these are great examples because they are that good node of public, private, and philanthropy coming together. And for us, frankly, they were no-brainer TAs to be part of. So the first example I want to give is hailing from the Philippines. So we were involved in funding a pre-feasibility study to identify potential offshore wind power zones and locations for development in the Philippines. So we were, that study, I think it's being published today, and I've been asked to point to the screen. So yes, you can access it. The study involved things like 1, site data collection, 2, interconnection analysis to the grid, 3, baseline environmental analysis, so the really hard stuff that is very much needed to develop nascent industries like offshore wind in this region. So how was this a PPP example? So TARA and the US Trade and Development Agency teamed up to provide the funding support. Then our partners at Rocky Mountain Institute came in to engage in the market study execution. And then finally, Clime Capital conceptualized the study and mobilized a publicly listed company in the Philippines to help. So that's one really big example. And we think this study could help unlock 3 gigawatts of offshore wind potential and potentially crowd in billions of dollars into the Philippines' nascent offshore wind industry. So the second example I would like to give you is actually happening right now as we speak. So we are supporting the development of a cutting-edge TA facility focused on the private sector. Going back to the 4 Ps, we are working with the public and the private sector with organizations like ETP, the Australian Development Agency, and more actors to get this off the ground. And the TA facility aims to provide pre-investment TA funding support to SMEs when they need the most, which is the early stage. And why did we decide to get involved? That is because we believe that capacity building support, whether that's OD, supporting companies on organizational development to improve their ESG profile as well, these things go hand in hand with success. And personally, I found this initiative particularly systemic because it integrates with Clime Capital's CSIF 2 fund that we've talked a lot about today. This means the companies have access to capital, but they also have access to TA support. And that's, I think, one of those perfect combinations of different things coming together and making catalytic impact.
Thank you so much. And I guess if anyone wants to hear more, thoroughly recommend catching any of the Clime team or I guess ETP, Tara Foundation, or ourselves afterwards. So Philip, what is the future of technical assistance in the region? What do we really need to accelerate the low carbon transmission?
So thanks. I think the best way to answer that is give an example of something we've done recently, which I think we can do more of this kind of thing. So we conducted, this is in Indonesia with PLN, the electricity utility. So we conducted detailed engineering and architectural design to upgrade PLN's existing main control center. Now it's at tender, and it's going to be crowding in funding probably from ADB. The new system will allow for the integration of variable renewable energy and manage the grid feeding nearly 165 million people in Java, Madura, and Bali. So it's a real big leap forward in decarbonizing the whole Indonesian energy system. But it has lots of add-on benefits. So for example, in addition to the obvious benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to boost energy security, it's going to lower electricity costs, particularly for poorer people, and it's going to create green jobs. So with that one, albeit fairly substantial TA, we've leveraged a huge amount of extra benefit. So that's the kind of thing I'm going to be looking for going forward. We should be moving out of the policy reform era into the actual doing phase. Somebody said earlier on, I think it was Bill said, you know, he's a doer, and I think climate change is urgent. It's got to happen as soon as possible. So we can't wait for perfection in the policy space. Once it's good enough, we have to move on and shift into implementation mode. And so I think, you know, project preparation and doing this kind of semi-TA that very quickly leads to major important investments is the way forward. Thanks.
I think it's interesting that key point, right, of moving from thinking to doing, and also maybe moving from kind of traditional approaches to the places where it is really novel and innovative, which I think is interesting with the private sector acceleration facility. Kevin, to kind of close us out, trying to get out of traditional thinking to sort of, I guess, again, looking to the future and what next, what do you think the role is for philanthropy and governments in terms of that novel, next edge, cutting edge?
Yeah, so I think you know, we should always think of what are the outstanding problems that need to be solved and then work backwards from that to the structure. So I see 2 other problems that we're trying to rally people around to solve. One is the additionality problem, and the second is around the revenue problem. So additionality problem-wise is, you know, sometimes people ask actually, why should if philanthropy is subsidizing the private sector, what additional benefits were achieved using blended finance? And we're quite inspired by what South Africa did around the Green Outcomes Fund, where basically they provided contingent TA. So they said to the funds, hey, if you're able to achieve certain types of outcomes around, for example, producing green jobs in your portfolios, reducing CO2 emissions, etc., then I will provide you with certain types of TA capital. So it makes it much more easy for the government and philanthropists to justify to their own stakeholders why the TA was provided, beyond the multiplier effect, which I think we already look at. But I think sometimes, again, the TA providers are philanthropists and governments, so they have different instruments to choose from. And sometimes the problem may not be risk, mandate, or something else. So it could, in fact, just be a revenue problem, where maybe there are different types of externalities from the carbon transition that nobody's paying for. And so here, perhaps the role of philanthropy or government is to internalize and pay for some of these social externalities. For example, such as whenever a green job is created, you could price that and pay for that. And actually in our other hats on the social side, that's where we've done a lot of contingent job payments, for example, from the government and philanthropy to incentivize that transition as well.
Thank you very much. So I'm very aware of this very big red blinking screen in front of me. We've got 2 questions coming in, so I guess we switch to the audience. The first is, does funding technical assistance extend to funding proof of concept? Where does TA start and end, or does the distinction even matter? We can maybe split them as well.
Yeah, I might or attempt to answer that question, but certainly one of the things I wanted to say from my experience in Indonesia is that, for example, the Indonesian government wouldn't take a loan from an international donor for TA. So that was where the Australian government came in, and that's too where philanthropy can come in, because they won't often take. Governments don't like to take loans for a lot of this work. They'd rather have it as a grant or something. So the role of that to support that is absolutely important. And I don't think that the distinction particularly matters about where does it start or finish. I think it's all the way along the sort of the value chain. But I think, as Philip rightly says, there's obviously increasing importance now in getting it into actually projects getting started up. So we should, all the policy reform end is critically there, but it's all along. But I think now, as we're moving in, the challenge of the energy transition is really, really significant, and now we need to get it into the project initiation, the procurement processes. I mean, it's absolutely critical, and the question about using it efficiently is because it's all about the skilling up and enabling the capability of the local officials and the local utilities and policymakers to do this themselves. It's not as if it's coming in from outside. It's building the capacity of the system, and for doing this in a lot of countries of Southeast Asia, there's still the transition is a very early stage, and we've got to be sped up rapidly, and that's going to require this kind of ability to do it domestically, internally, and not just to bring it in from Europe or the United States or Japan. It's got to be indigenous, and TA is critical to that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think we have to be careful about talking about cost efficient, because cost efficiency is relative depending on what you're trying to get out of. So TA can be used to be catalytic, so catalyzing, crowding in more capital, de-risking, and looking at quite far in the future. But sometimes you can use technical assistance to create direct outcomes right there. So particularly when it's invested, like post-investment technical assistance, that's looking at a particular company and investee and saying, how do we ensure they're creating outcomes right there? And you can tie that back a lot closer. So what is cost efficient? It depends on what you're trying to get out of your money. Others, so I guess the next question was, could you share any inputs? No, Philip.
Yeah, so I was going to have a...
I paused.
I was going to have a quick go at that one. Yeah, so what we don't want to do is to fund TA or studies which will sit on a shelf. They have to lead quickly to follow on work. So one thing that we do is to really scope out what are the follow-on possibilities. The other thing we have, particularly in one of our countries, I won't name which, but those of you who work there will recognise it, the government shops out the same studies to several different donors. So we do a bit of donor mapping before we fund anything to make sure no one else is funding, because you know the worst thing you want is you come into a room saying we're funding the study and it says, oh, but we're doing the same thing, you know, it's a nightmare. So yeah. The other thing I'd say is I'm personally quite skeptical about very long distance study tours, so sending people to the US or Europe. I think it's much better and more efficient and people learn more if it's done in the region. Now, of course, with Alistair sitting on the panel, Australia is obviously part of the region.
Hint, hint. I guess the question around why was TA required in the Philippines wind power study?
Yes, I can definitely answer that. So I think this piece of TA was not cheap to begin with. We're literally talking about going to different offshore wind site zones. But I think the bigger power in an organization like TARA being involved was the fact that if this power study was only limited to the publicly listed company, it would have been private. So, Milena, you talked about making sure that we have a public good. And through our involvement as an independent foundation, we were able to say, let's actually publish this report. So a lot of different companies can use it across. And this is the only catalytic way in which we will develop the nascent Philippines offshore wind market. And that's why we were involved.
Thank you so much. Other questions? We still have 2 minutes. Being very efficient here. Great question. Why should philanthropic capital subsidize the private sector? That is not a 2-minute question, but I'm really curious if anybody wants to jump in on that. Yeah.
Well, I don't think it is I mean, I don't think technical assistance is subsidising the private sector. As I said, you know, sources of in a number of countries of Southeast Asia, this kind of assistance won't be taken on loans or other forms of finance. That they'll be looking for grants to support that. So I don't think it is subsidising. As we heard before, blended finance. The point well made on the last panel was that blended finance isn't necessarily subsidised. It's blending in sources from a number of different places. I don't see it as subsidisation.
Yeah. Kevin and Philip.
Yeah, I think the common pitch, and this is me sitting on the philanthropic side often, or the family office side, is around leverage, right? According to convergence benchmarks, $1 leverage is about $4 today. But I think what people often forget from the family office side is that the family offices are not just providers of philanthropic capital. So for them, you know, Acumen has this great framework called the best alternative charitable option, which is, if I didn't give you this money, what else would I deploy it as, right? And for the family offices, they often think, I'm able to be on the private sector side too, so why should I give you the philanthropy? So I think a lot more rigor needs to be put into actually that question, which is, okay, so we are providing a 1-to-4 leverage ratio using my philanthropy side, but what is my best alternative as a family office if I were to invest that and donate that straight up? So oftentimes the bar that they ask for is much higher actually, and should be much higher than the 1-to-4.
Bumper sticker answer, Philip.
Yeah, so I was just going to react to the last question about value from the TA and say that it's not only the financial value, it's also the leverage value. We can bring in experts from all over the world. So if the government of Vietnam wanted to do TA, they'd have a limited pool of people. There'd be a lot of pressure to use only local expertise. We can bring in people from all over the world to supplement the local expertise. So it should be a blend of the two. So it's not just about the money.
And I think at times we actually are influencing the private sector to take on certain kinds of social outcomes or returns and lenses they wouldn't necessarily consider. So we are really meeting the goals of philanthropic actors, the development actors in these PPPs. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. This was greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mason, for inviting me. Can I invite all the panelists to come on stage, and we'll skip the introductions. Maybe the panelists can talk about what they do as part of their responses. Okay, welcome everyone to this panel that we're going to talk about debt financing. So like I said, we'll skip with the introductions, but I'll ask the panelists, as you provide your responses, maybe share some background as well to set the context on where you're coming from. Andrew, maybe we'll start off with you. Could you maybe just explain your business and how are you getting your business ready for debt?
Yeah, thanks for that, and nice to be here today. So our company, Stride, is all about trying to make solar energy more affordable and accessible in Vietnam. We're a Vietnam-based company. We're in Ho Chi Minh City, and we support all over the country. And we serve an underserved segment, which is residential households and SME businesses. We saw that there was a really good opportunity and a huge market segment in Vietnam and Southeast Asia more generally for this underserved segment. Most of the support we've seen so far in solar energy, and Vietnam has been a big adopter of solar energy so far, has been in the large C&I space and also the utility scale segment. But what we're not seeing is the support in residential and SME in Vietnam and also Southeast Asia more generally. Though if we look more broadly to the US and Australia, we see that this is an established model and it is something that is already working, and we are seeing solar at scale there. So with that in mind, we set up Stride a few years ago, and essentially what we've done is we've established a technology platform which connects customers who are interested in solar energy and with solar installers. So there's a large network of solar installers and funders, and these funders could be VCs who are putting equity in, they could be debt funders, and also they could be banks. And by connecting these three important players together, it's helping to fund and finance the transition to solar energy and hopefully a large uptake of solar energy. Since starting and having the equity investment from CSIF, which was very crucial for us in the early stages, we've seen a really good take-up. So we've grown 10 times in the last year from a small base, but we are growing very fast. We see that SME customers in particular, who are high energy users, and they're in the manufacturing sector, which is around 43% of all electricity use in Vietnam, are really liking our product, finding it easy to use, and really getting solar energy. So, we're seeing our business, it is growing, but what there will be is a need for debt funding to support our growth.
Yeah, so Andrew, maybe just sticking with you a little bit, maybe just share how have your conversations with bankers, whether in Vietnam or outside of Vietnam, how has that been?
Yeah, so I'm a former banker, I'll confess. So I was at HSBC for over 10 years, and also I was at Combank in Australia. So I know the banking sector very, very well. And look, to be honest, when we started Stride, I thought it would be a bit easier to raise funds, and maybe I was a bit naive in that aspect. I think essentially the key issue that I see, whether it's banks, DFIs, etc., is that the minimums that they look at is really too high for the kind of business that we start at a startup stage. So what I've tended to find out and learn is that the minimums that banks and DFIs will get out of bed is around $10 million US, right? And in the early stages, we simply just don't need that kind of money. We may grow into that, and we do hope to grow into that in the future. But in the early stages, it's difficult to be able to say that we can have a pipeline of 10 million in that need. And I think the great thing was, and we were very lucky with CSIF and providing the catalytic, sort of investment, was to look at us at a very early stage. And actually at that stage, we only had a small number of projects, but they could see the business model. And they understood that there is a big market out there, and they could see who the founders were in the team, and they invested. And that money, part of that money has been used to fund projects, and that has given us our good start. And then from there, we've been able to attract and raise more funds. We've also been able to, receive grants. So from an organisation called P4G, who have given us very good support as well to help, not so much on the solar asset side, but on all the other aspects, that might be around technology, marketing, etc. But I think, the next step for us is around working with specialised debt funders. We see some of them coming from Europe. And, we have something in the works there which I think will help us going forward.
Excellent, and congratulations on the growth. Jasper, it's no coincidence that I'm going to ask you the next question, right? UOB is also known as a great banker for SMEs in Singapore, at least. Maybe a quick response to Andrew's comment just now, and we do understand there's probably certain minimum sizes, but maybe just a quick response to Andrew's comment, and then I'll ask you maybe just to talk a little bit more about UOB's target sectors, markets, and really, what are you seeing, or what are the opportunities are you seeing in the region to accelerate some of the deployment?
Yeah, thanks, Laban. Andrew, we need to talk. I guess maybe just as an introduction, UOB is effectively we are a regional bank in Asia, headquartered in Singapore. For those that you're from outside of this region, we primarily is a full commercial bank. From retail all the way to wholesale. We started the journey actually in terms of sustainability about 7 years ago. We started to think, we started to get a lot of requests from our clients in terms of they wanted to go green or decarbonize, and we had to scale this up, right? So we started our Use Solar program in 2019, and we are quite lucky because we rolled this out across the region. We have already invested or financed 1 gigawatt of solar projects. Then we launched our energy efficiency program called U Energy. Then we launched U Drive for the EV and EV charging. And last November, we have launched U Build, which is actually for building owners. In that sense. The reason why we have done all this sustainability program is because we see that there's plenty of opportunities to scale up. As we know that, cities actually account for 70% of the carbon emission, right? And a lot of things are happening around us, and we need to do something about it, because from a UOB perspective, we have committed to net zero by 2050. And Scope 3 is our largest emission, right? In a sense that we also want to help our clients to decarbonize so that we can also reach our net zero goals. So from that perspective, I think that the challenge, I must agree with Andrew, because, a lot of the traditional funds that you speak to, they won't wake up if, my experience is $50, right? So if you cannot reach that hurdle, then, or you have to accumulate until then you can come and talk to me. So therefore, we actually started our program, and these programs actually doesn't just finance the project. We look at the entire value chain, because from my perspective, I cover the developers, the contractors, the operators, the equipment suppliers, the asset owners as well. So we can finance across the whole value chain, including retail as well. So our solar program actually also is applicable for residential clients as well. So from that perspective, we are covering end to end. And the way that we hope to scale up, right, is to be able to say that, okay, the DFIs are focusing on how to help the governments actually to put in the right policies in terms of, whether it's strengthening their grid or actually take the decommission those coal-fired power plants. From our perspective, we look at more helping the clients or SMEs actually to scale up. And we find that very challenging. because when we, some of these are, we have across our programs, we have about 70 to 80 partners now, right? And some of them are local champions, some of them are MNCs, right? So MNCs, no issue with financing. For the local champions and the SMEs, they are struggling, right? They're struggling. We can fund them from a debt perspective, but they also need the equity support, the technical assistance, and sometimes I really put my hats off, you know, with Joshua and Mason, in terms of the amount of hard work they have to put in there, not just looking at the investment plan, but also in terms of how to help the companies in terms of their management, how do you run or prepare them, you know, for scaling up. And that's where we find, you know, we wish that, I think other panels have spoke about to have more CSAF in this world so that we can work with them to actually bring our clients to them and say, hey, you know, we have these clients, you know, can you help them, you know, from an equity perspective or technical assistance, where, you know, we as a banker, you know, we don't have that skill set. Yeah.
Thanks, Jasper. It really does take a village. I'm just going to reorder it a little bit. Dennis, I'm going to move to you first before I get back to Marat. Dennis, could you just talk a little bit about your business, you know, what you've been able to achieve, and also, you know, maybe share a little bit of insights based on your conversations with the banks. Yeah.
Mober is a green tech logistic in the Philippines. We deliver using 100% EV. We have blue chips client like IKEA, Nestle, Unilever, Starbucks, and even Kuninago. We started with 2 units, 2021, now we have 60. We help businesses decarbonize their delivery quickly without them having to invest into EV. You know, with it could have, now we have 60 units from 2, we now have 60. It could have been 150 if we are able to get financing from the bank. I will be very frank, when you ask me if we're able to get financing from the bank, I would say zero, nada, you know, in the Philippines. There's no commercial banks in the Philippines funding commercial EVs. Recently, I just received a text from one of the biggest bank in the Philippines who just received 250 million green fund from IFC, telling me, Dennis, our Crecom loves your business model. It's solid. However, we want to wait for the EV industry to mature. I said, how can that happen if Mober has the largest fleet of EV in the Philippines and you want it to wait for a maturity, right? So, however, on the other side, we've been talking to DBP, Land Bank, and I think our applications are progressing. So it's very, very disappointing from a founder's point of view, where that I could have increased our fleet to 300 if we have, right? So we're able to serve more zero or zero emission delivery in the Philippines.
No, thanks so much for that, Dennis. Marat, it seems like this was really teed up for you right now, right? So Pentagreen set up with a quite a specific objective. And, you know, after hearing Andrew and Dennis, I'm sure you guys are going to have a long conversation after this. But besides that, you know, Marat, can you just share a little bit about some of the gaps you see? I think Andrew and Dennis already started to talk about it. But maybe the role of Pentagreen then in trying to fill some of these gaps and working with them to get them ready such that at some point, you know, some of the bigger boys might be able to come in and help them grow.
Yeah, thanks, Lawan. Indeed, this it seems like a very productive panel already. Best business development panel for us, I think, already 2 potential clients. So thanks, Clime Capital team, for having me here. And look, I think this is just indicative of some of the problem statements that are arising in the market, right? Earlier on, we talked about blended finance in the form of technical assistance to solve particular problems. There is the likes of CSEF, etc., to solve the early stage equity problem. The debt problem seems to be somewhat of a perception that debt is boring, debt is not a problem, debt is solved. Look at the banks, so much money out there willing to lend, etc., etc. The discovery, perhaps, for all of us in the recent years or so, is that even once you solve the early stage equity and the project development piece, often you find out that the debt problem is still there, and no further amount of technical assistance is going to make that SME off-taker for your solar rooftop a more bankable counterparty. And yet the assets and the projects need debt at some point to scale. The equity runway runs out. Equity, I'm sure, starts looking for a return, a levered return, and infrastructure needs leverage to make it work. And that's where some of these debt gaps start to arise, because the bank will say, look, if it's not $50 million or $20 million, whatever it is, then it's too early. Even the MDBs of this world at times might say, hey, you know, your EV business model is not mature enough. It doesn't have that longevity of track record such that I can convince my credit officer internally that this is a good deal and financing should be offered. So these types of gaps start to arise, and it's in recognition of this problem that Pentagreen was set up by 4 partners, Temasek and HSBC primarily, who are putting the capital at this stage. And we're also fortunate to have with us the Asian Development Bank as a strategic partner and Clifford Capital as a strategic partner, another Temasek Singapore government-linked infrastructure finance house. And the idea was that, look, clearly because of some of the problems that were outlined by fellow panelists, we need to find and we need to perhaps create a very specialized debt financing vehicle that will be able to help bridge those gaps between where the early stage equity might leave off and before the project, the situation, the business model becomes more so-called mainstream and more acceptable and more quote-unquote bankable. And that's the space into which Pentagreen is looking to contribute our capital. Through a debt product. We are doing our first few transactions now. We signed a transaction in the Philippines last year, a mezzanine financing for a young renewable energy company. We're working on CNI, commercial and industrial rooftop portfolio in Vietnam, similar type of business model in Indonesia, and looking to scale up and do more. So indeed, looking forward to further conversations with you guys and others in the room.
Thanks, Marat. And I know that the topic that we're supposed to talk about is debt, but I think Jasper started alluding to some of the equity investments that need to be in place as well. So there's a large appetite question for Jasper, large appetite for capital. Question is there a missing class of equity investors? And what do you think is holding back the traditional infra investors to provide equity in these subsectors? And before you start with some of your responses, I just wanted to share Infrastructure Asia. We have looked at some of the data that's coming out from the Global Infrastructure Hub. And you will notice actually over the last couple of years, the amount of institutional capital that is coming to this part of the world is actually going down. There's actually been a shift in a lot of institutional capital that's going to the Northern Hemisphere, largely because they have really, really good positions, whether it's the IRA or the European Green Economy deal. There's a lot of capital that's flowing that way and less capital that's coming to this. So the problems here will continue to be exacerbated. But, Jasper, some quick reflections from you on this topic of where are the large institutional equity capital, what's holding them back?
Okay, I will answer this way. I think from a risk perspective, right? I think whether you're equity, whether you're debt, we are aligned as well as with the business owner as well. The question is in terms of scale and also in terms of preparedness. A lot of times when we come across a company or even our existing clients, they know how to do it. The expertise is there, right? But the challenge is that they don't know how to position themselves and how to actually make it or present it in a way that it makes sense for financial investors. Obviously, one good example is Sunseap, a Singapore solar company that we started financing them very, very early on when they just started in early 2010. And of course, 2 years ago, they became a unicorn, and then they were sold off to divested to EDPR. We wanted to have a lot more of these stories and investment companies that can actually help. So I guess the crux is the technical assistance, I think, is required. And this is where the hard work is, and a lot of time the funds or even the banks ourselves doesn't have that capacity or doesn't have that time to actually allow us to prepare those companies actually to make the project bankable, right? The business plan may make sense or they is ready to scale out, but it's just that some parts of it is missing. And of course, the other thing is from a senior lender perspective, we also would love to work with equity providers to understand, like Pentagreen, where are they coming from, how we can work together, how, what are the things that you're looking for, is it impact or is it return? What is your investment timeline? We can go long because we are more the traditional. The other point is also from a commercial bank perspective, we can help with the brick and mortar in terms of they require performance bonds, issuance, and LC. So these are all day to day, which is kind of boring, but it's critical for the companies to scale up. Yeah.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Jasper. If I can just stick with you, but before I go to your question, maybe like Andrew and Dennis to look at the first question here, and once I'm done with Jasper, maybe I'll get you to chime in on the first question. But Jasper, the question here is really what percentage of your renewable and energy efficient portfolio is outside Singapore? And what's the smallest loan size UOB provides? I think there's some really interested clients in the room. Jasper, you got to stay back after this.
Okay, so actually a lot of our portfolio are actually outside of Singapore. So come and talk to us. We primarily focus on Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. We have already financed a couple of solar rooftop portfolios. From an energy efficiency perspective, more active markets for us are Singapore, of course. The regulations are there, support is there. Thailand is also another active market. Indonesia is a bit slow. Malaysia is really up and coming because of their EECA Act is going, quote unquote, to be gazetted by the end of this year. So we're hoping that there will be a lot more activities that will be coming up. We work very closely with the host governments as well to understand how can we collaborate with them, whether they have any sort of grants that our clients can tap, or the ESCOs can tap as well, so that to create that momentum and awareness. And a lot of times it's the awareness. In terms of coming back to the smaller business size loan, I think we don't have a minimum, but we look at the scale, right? You need to have a business plan that you can scale realistically, and how we're going to get there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Maybe Andrew and Dennis, I think the part that's interesting here is how do small startups struggle with cash flow balance, debt versus impact investing? Maybe if I can get you to just chime in on that, although that may not be something that you are looking at, but I'm sure you speak to many folks who are dealing with this issue.
Yeah, I guess for any small startup, cash is limited and cash flow. and seek, so that we have to look at ways in which we can raise more capital, and then it's balancing that, I guess, against the owner's equity in the company and dilution. So that's where I guess there just needs to look at the different options available in terms of equity investment, and there may be different forms of that, and that can have different structuring, and then different debt instruments. So there's options available, but I think there's no one size fits all.
Dennis?
I think Jasper Mober will be a good fit for you to be the first in the Philippines, because you mentioned all the neighboring countries without the Philippines, right? I mean, I would like to add what Mober has been doing. Aside from doing EV delivery, we also help our driver, which we call them GDS, the Green Delivery Specialists, train them how to use EV. We also help the mom and pops transport provider to empower them to transition to EV. So we will grow Mober by renting our EVs to them so that they can also transition to EV. So since we have the biggest fleet in the Philippines, and we can afford to set up our own charging station. So moving forward, our charging station will be designed for public use also. So that's our ecosystem now in Mober. Yeah.
Thanks, Dennis. Actually, Marat, I was going to end off with you. There was a question earlier on about the high interest rate environment and how that is affecting the green transition. You are in the region quite a lot. You speak to a lot of folks in the region. Maybe in 30 seconds, just to close us off, is it a case of this is the new normal, get used to it, or is there something else that you've been hearing?
It looks like it's the new normal. Get used to it, I dare say. But look, I think the interest rate environment globally is just exacerbating the problem, right? Because right now, if you're a cold-hearted commercial investor, global capital allocator, and you look globally, where do I get some return for the lowest risk? You'll probably find that in places like the US or Europe or very mature jurisdictions, you're getting some very good yields, very good returns for very fairly low risk type of investments, right? Whereas if you look at a place like Vietnam, for example, you're dealing with local corporate credit risk, local corporate SME off-takers. You need to do long-dated financing, and you can't even price that risk at a level which globally might be competitive. So we're actually seeing a bit of a pullback of commercial capital, international commercial capital, from much more greenfield, earlier stage, emerging markets type of situations. And that's exacerbating that risk-reward disconnect. So something needs to solve for that. We think, given this is the topic, we think it's blended finance, and blended finance constructs can be very powerful at bridging that gap. But perhaps I'll leave there. That's too broad and deeper topic to expand on.
Thanks very much, Marat. Sorry, we are all out of time, but I think our panelists will be here. After that, if you have some questions, please approach the panelists. Please put your hands together to thank my panelists.
Thank you so much, Mason. It's great to be here. And thank you once again to Clime Capital and Philanthropy Asia Alliance for inviting me here today to be part of this exciting conversation. May I invite all the panelists to join me on stage? Wonderful. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you all for sticking with this. We can tell you're all true believers. But it's, Mason, to your remarks, this is such an important conversation because as we've seen in many studies, we really see the growing importance of the nexus between gender and climate. women are not only disproportionately affected by climate change, but very often they are also the agents of change in advancing climate action. And that is no different in low carbon transition. So we're really excited to spotlight some of the innovations and solutions that we are seeing in the field today. So joining me today, I'm very excited to welcome Fran, who is a global climate lead and manages the Gender and Climate Program under the Gender and Economic Inclusion Department of the IFC, a member of the World Bank Group. I'm excited to welcome Raleigh, who is partner and head of investments at impact asset management firm Sarona, and who heads the Singapore office. Ruth, welcome. Ruth is president of Upgrade Energy Philippines and has over 20 years of experience in renewable energy, developing wind, hydro, and solar projects. And I'm also excited to welcome Isabella, who has been in the fund industry for 20 years and is the COO at Clime Capital. So today, I'm so honored and delighted to be with you all. And I would like to start with Fran. So we often hear about the gender and climate nexus, or the need to integrate gender into climate investment. But what does this actually mean, and how is IFC thinking about this?
Thanks so much for the question. I also want to thank Mason for making space for this topic. It's not often that we get the chance to talk about gender in an audience filled with climate specialists. It's typically the reverse, that we're speaking amongst each other. So this is really an opportunity to explain what this really means. And I want to take a moment to say that I think we hear gender, and I think we still hear women. And actually, gender is about inclusion. It's about who's present at decision-making tables when big decisions are getting made, such as where climate finance is going. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about this and getting back to the why this matters, because I think the why will tell us a lot about the how. And the why is really distilled into 3 key narratives that we've seen in particular, as we've kind of engaged in this space of gender-inclusive climate action. The first one, I think it's the one that we typically think of. It's the idea that climate change is not gender neutral. So when we think about the impacts of climate change, depending on who you are, you experience those impacts very differently. And we see a growing body of evidence that shows us that women, girls, children, but also disadvantaged groups are continually disadvantaged to a greater extent from new climate-related risks. So that's the first perspective. That's the one that I think most of us might be familiar with. Now, the second perspective, I think the one that's really, really critical, and the one we don't like to talk about, it's the idea that as we invest from a climate perspective, as we get on this arc of a green transition, we'll likely see an increase and a widening of gender gaps. So these are gaps between men and women. And the reason for that is we look at the sectors that are poised for growth in the green transition: transport, construction, renewable energy. These are all areas that women are particularly not represented in. And so if we think of financing that transition, we need to be thinking of inclusion at the forefront. Otherwise, we're likely to actually widen those gaps. Now, that's narrative 2. Narrative 3, which is my favorite one, it's the idea, and I think it was mentioned by Natalie, women are really critical stakeholders. We really cannot achieve decarbonization and locally led adaptation at the scale and at the pace that is required without tapping into half the market. And that truth, that is what we need to come back to when we think about designing, whether it's large-scale decarbonization programming or large-scale infrastructure investments. That's the truth that we need to be considering and coming back to. So yeah, thanks for the question. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Fran, for reminding us all of the why of this gender and climate nexus. And now I'd like to move to Raleigh to talk a little bit about the how. So it would be great for you to share some examples you might have seen in your portfolio or the wider ecosystem for innovative solutions in gender and climate.
Thank you, Natalie, and great to see everybody here today. So I'll start by just giving a bit of a background. So we are one of the limited partners in CSEF2, first loss provider through the Australian Development Investments, which is a fund of funds by the Australian government that Sirona manages. So I'd like to take what Fran said and make it a lot more concrete what that means for us as LPs and how we can influence our partners. And we work with both climate-focused funds as well as gender-focused funds. So there's an opportunity for us as an LP to bring a gender lens to the climate funds and bring a climate lens to the gender funds. So what does that mean concretely in practice? Well, we heard that women might get left behind, particularly in renewable energy and other climate sectors. We also know that, statistically speaking, more gender diverse investment teams invest in more gender diverse companies. And so one of the very concrete ways we try to address this potential risk is by requiring greater gender diversity from our partners, particularly in their decision-making bodies like investment committees or boards, as well as on their senior teams. So for example, with Clime, what we've been working on is adding a senior investment committee member to their IC. And it has been a task that actually has been part of our technical assistance plan. We heard a lot about TA earlier in the panel. So that's one very concrete example where the Australian TA dollar is going is, first of all, working a little bit on the why, because there's still a lot of education to be done, even with other LPs, why this is important, why this is necessary. And second, on the how, right? Where do we find the suitable and qualified women with 20 years of climate experience when women haven't been in senior roles in private equity and venture capital for that long, right? So that's a challenge in and of itself. So even when we have aligned partners like Clime who are very willing to work with us on that, we still need to help them get there. And so our technical assistance provider, Sagana, you heard from Elena earlier, they've been involved in identifying these kinds of candidates. Another concrete example, again with technical assistance focus, is we are working with Clime on designing a TA facility. Obviously, it's climate focused, that's the investment strategy of the fund, but we are ensuring that the gender lens is not forgotten. And so what that means also is gender lens technical assistance for the underlying portfolio companies of this TA facility. And then on the flip side, I should mention also gender funds that we work with, they tend to be less, I guess, versed in the climate risks and opportunities. So we help them be able to design these solutions in their value creation plans with their portfolio companies. So it really works both ways, and we essentially believe that a gender and a climate lens should be a part of any investment strategy.
Thanks, Raleigh. So we've heard from Fran about the why. We've heard from Raleigh from the investor perspective. And now let's hear from Ruth as the CEO of a female-led and owned business. What ways can philanthropy and other investors who are seeking impact help growing companies like Upgrade?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear from what you're saying about women should be included because, you know, for me, it was such a struggle as well in the Philippines. Very few women in the energy sectors are there in the leadership roles. But for me, I made sure that as a CEO of Upgrade Energy that we actually have gender equality. So we have about 15 women and 15 men, and very much aware that, you know, this thing is there so that, you know, as an engineering procurement construction company, it's perceived as a man's world, and for us to be deliberate in choosing the people that we work with, the team members, I think is a first step towards, you know, getting gender equality in the near future. So yes, how can philanthropy fund help us? I think it's really important that like a blended finance, right? We talk about blended finance like Clime Capital CSEF 1 and 2 to support women-led companies because it's only like 2 or 3% of the funds in the world are women-led, right? Like, I think it was 2% last year, maybe 3% this year. It's a long way to go, but I'd like to announce that Clime Capital through CSEF 1 and 2 has invested in Upgrade Energy Philippines, and it's really important for us that this this point in our company that we are ready to scale and grow our business, that we are given convertible loan by CSEF 1 and 2. So it is a catalyst for us, right? Earlier we heard them saying that it's like a, what you call it, magic dust. Yes, that you need. Everyone that comes to the Philippines is looking for a shovel-ready project. Now, how do you get there? How do you get there? I've been in this business for more than 20 years. I'm chair of the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines Energy Committee. I'm the energy chair of the Management Association of the Philippines. And we've seen that the time for investment in the energy sector, for renewable energy has come. The Philippine government has appointed a Secretary of Energy that is actually very supportive in the growth of renewable energy, removing barriers in the development of rooftop solar, for example, for commercial and industrial size. So yes, I think investments such as this is really, really important for us to grow our business.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing the importance of investments like that, fit for purpose, and also what you're doing within your team to advance gender equity as well. And speaking of looking within the team, turning to you, Isabella, we can already see that Clime Capital is a pretty awesome team from putting this event together. But we'd love to hear more from you. You know, as a fund manager, what is Clime Capital doing to promote gender diversity within the team? And what are the steps that you would recommend for fund managers to embrace gender diversity?
All right. First of all, it's really an honor to being the panel here. Then, for Clime Capital being the fund manager, I would say it's an encouraging steps that we managed to achieve is like out of the 17 staff, 5 full-time working from home, and like 4 of them are the mommy. Then and within the team we achieved like 60% of like ladies being in the team. So like it's an encouraging stats, and how it happened pretty much you have to start off with like opportunity being given. Then next is like training, patient training. And it takes time for the team to grow with like the experience when they come across like say deal, and like all the elements need to be encompassed, while like the requirements that being put forward from the LPs is really need to be taken into account. Next is like patient with like all the investee company to indicate what's necessary and like what need to be action on the ground. Then to put a team together, I think a lot got to do with like a focus on like what is the goal, what is the objective. So like when the entire team, it doesn't matter is girls or boys, like when the objective is set, the goal is set, like, and responsibility and expectation is set, like the team and basically will really charge forwards and like try to bring through the effect of the to achieve the ultimate goal. Then like it's a blessing that like Clime Capital managed to enjoy the benefits from the workforce coming from both like gender. So yeah, I would say so far is a very blessing outcome.
Thanks, Isabella, for sharing those concrete steps that fund managers can take. And continuing on this train of thought for concrete steps, Rally, I'd like to turn to you to tell us some more about what is the greatest challenge to embed a gender lens in the climate fund.
Thanks, Natalie. I think as far as it goes on the team of the fund manager, typically we work with very values aligned partners like Clime, so we haven't met too much resistance there. I think where the concerns start coming is at the company level. So there is a concern that, we're going to be narrowing down our pipeline if, for example, the LPs put requirements around how many companies need to be led by women. So that's one concern. I guess how we react to that understandingly on one hand, but on the other, it might mean that you might need to widen your aperture of pipeline activities and uncover opportunities that maybe you haven't been able to reach before. And the second challenge is, we expect and aspire that some of these values and aspirations are trickled down to the portfolio companies. And there the concern comes from sometimes from the portfolio companies themselves, not always, of, look, we understand, but we have too many other sort of fires to put out as a startup. So we're going to attend to the gender or diversity and equity issue a little bit later. And I think there we need a very much values-aligned partner in the face of the fund manager to be able to frame or position this issue as positive for the business. The gender is not a standalone topic. It permeates all sort of pillars of building your business, from governance to product to your team and corporate culture, right? So it takes a lot of coaching, I would say, and that's why we have technical assistant programs. As Isabella said, it's definitely a journey, and it is for every firm. And as long as I think the willingness is there and the openness is there, the technical assistance dollars are there. But it does take a village and a partnership to get there, and that the role of the fund manager is extremely important to kind of impress the importance of that topic with the portfolio companies. I'd love to hear your perspective, actually.
What do you mean, like?
Whether you find that as a challenge to think about gender and gender lens as you build out your company?
I think it's really about awareness and political will. And then every opportunity I get as well, I try and talk to my colleagues in the industry about, having gender lens in choosing their team members, the board. Like for our board, we're 40% female. So yeah, I think we can all be ambassador for getting women on different like the board or the management level. It's just being deliberate, I think. And I think it's a mindset also. It's a behavioral thing that needs to change. It's very old-fashioned, right? Not to include women. I think not including women in the conversation or in the management role, for example, the business is just losing out, right? Because you have that different perspective that you are not capitalizing or leveraging. So yeah.
Thanks, Ruth and Rally, for really sharing how you've overcome some of these challenges and translated them into opportunities. And maybe coming to Isabella now. Earlier, you had mentioned some of the things you're doing to promote gender diversity, yet we've seen that within the industry, there is still a gender gap. So how has blended finance allowed you to narrow this gap?
Okay, I would say like the stats roughly for the fund industry, 20%, I think is still a better stats than renewable sector. Then like in terms of blended finance, how like can bring in the effort, like it's really about patience. So like the development maybe not immediately, but like but at least as a start, have women being participate in the industry and like as time goes by, we will have generation and after generation of women with relevant experience in investment. It's something not overnight because, like, I mean, as you attended this event through the day, you will see different like capital stack. Some actually is representing government, DFI, then some is from philanthropic, actually is from very accomplished like entrepreneurs that they trying to set up mandate and try to do the right things. Then probably next is like really give everybody an opportunity to come to the table to discuss through. I think is pretty much the beauty of like how it happened for within Clime Capital and with Dean's help. Thanks a lot. Having everyone really sit down to go through actually what's the parameter of the objective that we trying to achieve. Then like along with that, standardize, keep things simple, manageable. Then eventually we'll have an outcome together, like to be a realistic like services or product, solar services. The Papa Mami can like choose the solar to be energy of the home, to be the action that take place. Yeah.
Thanks, Isabella. So we've heard from the fund manager level, the business level, the investor level, and now I'd like to take it back to thinking about advancing as an ecosystem and as an economy. So coming to you, Fran, what can standard setters like IFC do to promote gender in climate investments?
Great. I see that clock ticking, and I know we're standing between you and the first drink of the night. So I'll try to be brief here. There's a lot to cover. I think, IFC, our bread and butter is investment. That's what we do. And I think it's been mentioned by a lot of people in the room today that we're expensive, we're hard to work with, we are, arduous in terms of what's required, and we're not very fast. So I think, and now we're going to layer gender onto that. Now we're going to ask you as the client to also be thinking about gender. And you'll see we get a lot of resistance internally, even at IFC, with people that sit on the deal table. We need to do something in terms of standard setting there. Because if IFC doesn't do it, no one else will. And that's the key point. So while it's expensive, while it's arduous, it's really, really, really important to be thinking about using investment, whether you consider it a carrot or a stick or whatever, to use that to push clients to do more on gender inclusion and diversity. And I think we've covered a lot of different levels of intervention. It's not just about extending more finance to women-led businesses, which is critical, but it's also about women's employment. Can you be working with your portfolio companies to be looking at how many women they're employing? Can you be working with your portfolio companies to see if their green products and services are extending to women consumers? And these ways of impact are really, really important, and sometimes they're really low-hanging fruit. So we sat down with a fund last week, and they have 0 women founders in their pipeline. And so they were quite resistant to us saying, please do 25%. But actually, when we went back to the drawing table and we looked at the companies in their pipeline, the impact from a gender perspective could be massive if you start to look at that from a consumption and from an access perspective. So I want to leave you with there is low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of ways to intervene in this space. And blended finance is really critical for that because we take climate, which is rightly or wrongly still perceived as quite risky, and we take gender, which is rightly or wrongly also perceived as quite risky, and we combine them, we'll get resistance. So blended finance in whatever form could be performance-based incentives, could be de-risking an investment that has significant impact on women end users. It could be any of those instruments, but really starting to feed financing towards initiatives, programs, companies that are really looking at gender in a very intentional and ideally integrated way. And that's really the power of blended finance and the power of standard setting and showing by example, despite it being quite tricky in some instances. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Fran, Raleigh, Ruth, and Isabella. This conversation has made me feel so hopeful. We really showcased a lot of solutions, and we also talked about challenges, but how to overcome them and turn them into opportunities. And at 2X Global, for those of you who may not know us, we were founded by the G7 Development Finance Institutions in 2018, and we've since mobilized over $27 billion in Genderland's investing capital. And together with the investors that we work with, we really see this gender and climate nexus as key to building more resilient economies. And just thank you so much again for really creating the space to build the businesses, the fund managers, the investments, and the ecosystem and the standards. Thank you once again. Can I invite you all to give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this afternoon's partner event led by our friends at Clime Capital. Today's session has underscored the importance of leveraging innovative financing models to accelerate positive impact. It has also underlined the importance of private, public, and philanthropic partnerships, or PPPPs, to scale the adoption of such financing mechanisms. Blended finance is a strong example of a tool that can support our journey towards a more sustainable future. And we've seen this in action. Partners like Clime Capital have set an example of what success could look like with their blended PPPP fund that mobilizes capital across the different Ps to accelerate decarbonization. But there are still ways to go to increase the adoption of blended finance to fund the low-carbon transition. From today's discussion, I took away 3 key things which I believe can guide our journey forward. First, multi-sector partnerships must underpin all efforts. Philanthropy, in particular, can make a difference in a blended financing model by first providing catalytic capital to pilot decarbonization solutions. This in turn draws in private capital and the support of public capital towards a sustainable state. Second, the importance of technical assistance. Beyond funding, more needs to be done to help impact SMEs and startups get off the ground and demonstrate viability. We must partner up to double down on capacity building initiatives to support and accelerate the progress of investee companies in reaching their goals. Third, the positive trajectory of inclusivity and empowerment. Our panel of inspiring female leaders discussed the importance of promoting diversity in the impact investment space and how we can enable more women to lead the way forward towards their low-carbon transition. I would like to express our deep appreciation to Mason and the Clime Capital team, as well as all our speakers and attendees for making this session a rich and meaningful one. Let's continue to sustain the momentum from our discussions and forge ahead with courage, conviction, and collaboration. It's been a packed 3 days, and I wish everyone a restful evening. Thank you.
Let me just adjust so I'm not creating too much interference. There we go. Thank you very much for those kind words, Mason, and thanks for inviting me along to this Philanthropy Asia Summit. And at the outset, can I commend the fantastic work by Temasek, by Clime Capital, and many of you in the room, and what you're doing to crowd in investment across the region's climate finance gap. Now, as some of the previous speakers have said, I too appreciate that I'm one of the very final speakers in what has been an excellent, albeit very long, couple of days of discussions here, and that this is, of course, the final session between you and drinks. But as a representative of the Australian government, it would be remiss of me not to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about our work in this space. But I can assure you that the drinks taste a whole lot better when you've had to endure a government talking head speaking at you about what they're doing. So Australia's blended development finance investment mechanisms are investing in a pretty innovative way, for a government at least, and a catalytic way. Our 250 million Australian dollar blended finance fund, which is called Australian Development Investments, or ADI, is providing early stage and concessional investment in promising climate and gender impact funds. ADI is working closely with its investees to build their capability and investability. This supports them to provide finance to small and medium enterprises in that missing middle who struggle to obtain financing from traditional sources. We're proud to have closed ADI's investment into Clime Capital's second Southeast Asia Clean Energy Fund, or CCEF2, in January this year. ADI's anchor investment assisted CCEF2 to reach an initial fundraising amount of 200 million Australian dollars. So this helped to mobilise over $50 million. Sorry, I should say our investment was only 4.5 million Australian dollars, but that helped to mobilise 50 million from private investors and encouraged like-minded DFIs. It's the first investment fund to blend philanthropy, public and private investment to support climate businesses in Southeast Asia. And as has been discussed today, technical assistance is really integral to how Australia approaches its climate finance portfolio. And ADI provides technical assistance to both SME funds and the underlying SMEs themselves that are applying for finance. The Australian Government is also proud to support Clime Capital's Private Sector Acceleration Technical Assistance Facility. Mason, I'm not sure if you've got an acronym or a shorthand for that yet, but PSATAF didn't work in my mind when I was preparing. But what that facility is doing is helping to build a market of investable climate opportunities to accelerate impact outcomes in the region. And as you've all been discussing today, philanthropic capital can also act in a similar way, supporting projects or funds through that valley of death to help an innovative idea reach scale. Private capital is available to be invested in projects or funds that have the right risk and return ratios in quantums that governments and philanthropists could not achieve on their own. So what I'm trying to say is, to quote the famous saying, if you want to go fast, go it alone, but if you want to go far, do it together. So it's our objective as a government, through our blended finance transactions, to help create the conditions that allow all three sources of funding, public, private and philanthropic, to bring their respective strengths to bear. But we do still need much greater collaboration at all levels to strengthen the impact. So events like this and work by Clime Capital and others are so meaningful by bringing together the major funder groups central to this outcome. I encourage funders and financiers in the room today to seriously consider how you can participate in blended finance structures to accelerate the region's low carbon transition and climate adaptation. So thank you to Mason and the Clime Capital team, as well as Temasek Trust for co-hosting this session, and to all the panellists for sharing your insights. I look forward to continuing the discussions over drinks. Thank you.
Okay, I really am the last speaker. I promise. Okay, Temasek Trust, the Philanthropy Asia Alliance. This is a really great initiative, don't you think? I mean, this combination is really terrific. It provides an opportunity for us to get together and think about what the president of Singapore called the other night a whole new model for economics. What was the president's message? He said that philanthropy historically has been about doing good. What does it need to be in today's world? What does philanthropy need to be? His charge to us was to be risk capital. Risk capital. That's what the minister just talked about. Australia being willing to be risk capital in Clime's fund. That is so innovative. It's hard to overstate how important it is for governments to be willing to do that. And for Australia to have led the way, I commend you. What we're trying to do at Allied Climate Partners is to help really important general partners, investors, Mason, Josh, Isabella, the team at Clime, really knowledgeable and important investors in their region have the capital necessary to do innovative things. At Allied Climate Partners, we're doing the same in Africa, in the Caribbean and Central America, India, and then we'll do sectoral funds. Each of these funds will have wealthy people in the junior with, hopefully, Australia and other governments, and then DFIs, private sector, and other types of instruments in the senior capital. That capital is meant to mobilize additional capital. So what Clime is doing is mobilizing and has mobilized 25 times the money that it's invested in its initial fund. $22 million fund led to a $127 million fund, now a $175 million fund, mobilizing hopefully about $12 billion of capital. I'm on the private sector investment lab of the World Bank. The shortfall of capital and equity globally around climate, not globally, in the global south, in the emerging markets, excluding China, of equity per annum is about $600 billion. That's the shortfall, $600 billion. That assumes quite a bit of debt, about 65-35. I don't think it'll be that much, so I think that understates the number. We're not able to speak for billions right now in terms of the equity that Mason and Josh and the team have, but maybe they will. And even with this capital, they will mobilize, we think, about 12 billion. So that's been a tribute to them, but also to all of you. We're working closely with Temasek and with MAS now on other funds in Southeast Asia. We think this is a winning combination of combining philanthropy, the public sector, the private sector, and blazing a trail, we hope, for the private sector to come in more strongly. Philanthropy doesn't have the capital to do this. Governments and the private sector do. And that's what we need to encourage. I hope you have a great evening. I'm out front. I'll buy a beer if anyone wants one, especially for the Australians in the room. Thank you very much.